Yo, what's up everyone? It's Watch Harry, and today we're checking out, what if Harry collapsed at Gringotts at age 7 and woke up as Lord of 10 ancient bloodlines and Archmage. Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Fell. The Dursleys did not take Harry to Gringotts out of kindness. Kindness was not something the Dursleys kept in ready supply, and what little they managed was rationed carefully between themselves and Dudley, with none left over for the small, dark-haired boy currently wedged into the back corner of the car with his knees pulled to his chest. Vernon drove with both hands tight on the wheel, the way he always did when something was making him angry and he couldn't shout about it yet. Petunia sat rigid in the passenger seat, her neck craned forward like a nervous bird. Dudley took up the remaining two-thirds of the back seat, eating crisps loudly and watching Harry with small, suspicious eyes. They were going to Gringotts because Vernon had found the letter. It had come 3 months ago, a stiff cream envelope sealed with wax, addressed in neat copperplate to Mr. H. Potter, the cupboard under the stairs, for Privet Drive. Vernon had confiscated it before Harry even knew it existed, but he hadn't burned it the way he burned the others. He'd read it in the shed with the door locked, and when he came out his face was a complicated color that sat somewhere between purple and gray. The letter, Harry would later learn, was from Gringotts Bank. It informed him that on the occasion of his 7th birthday, his account access had been expanded to include a secondary trust vault established by his maternal grandparents, and that he was cordially invited to visit the bank to review a matter of inheritance that required his personal presence. What Vernon heard, underneath all that careful bank language, was money. And so here they were, pulling into the Charing Cross Road and parking badly, Vernon already composing the story in his head. We're his guardians, the boy can't manage his own affairs, naturally we'd need to oversee any financial matters, while Harry looked out the window at London waking up in the morning grey and tried to work out what was happening. He knew it was something to do with his parents. That much he'd gathered from the way Vernon's face had gone strange when he announced they were making a trip. He knew the name Gringotts from the letter he'd glimpsed once over Petunia's shoulder. Quickly, before she'd snatched it away, that letter had been burned. He knew he was not supposed to ask questions. He asked one anyway. Are we going to my parents' bank? Vernon's hands tightened on the wheel. Don't talk. Harry looked back out the window. The sky was the color of old pewter, and pigeons were arguing over something on a windowsill above a bookshop. He thought about his parents the way he always did, carefully, at a distance, like touching something through glass. He didn't know much. A car crash, Petunia had said, and then nothing more, her face closing like a door. He'd stopped believing the car crash story around age 5. He couldn't have said why. He just knew, the way he sometimes knew things, the way he'd known last Tuesday that Mrs. Fig's cat was going to be sick before it was, the way he'd known the answer to a maths problem before he'd properly read it, that Petunia was lying. Not stretching the truth. Actually, deliberately lying, with both hands. He stored the knowledge away with everything else he'd stored away and said nothing. The Leaky Cauldron was a grimy little pub that most people walked past without seeing, which Harry found interesting. Vernon could see it, clearly, because he steered them straight toward it without hesitation, though his expression suggested he'd rather be steering toward a canal. The barman was a cheerful, toothless man who started to smile at Harry and then stopped, looking at him with an odd, searching expression, and Harry filed that away too. The alley beyond was the most extraordinary thing Harry had ever seen. He stopped walking almost immediately, which made Dudley cannon into him from behind, which made Dudley yelp, which made Vernon hiss at all of them to keep moving. But Harry had already seen it, the impossible high street of it, the moving signs and bubbling cauldrons in the windows and a cage of tiny, luminous birds in front of an apothecary. He had already felt it, which was different. There was something in the air here that settled against his skin like sunlight, like something recognizing him. He'd felt things like that before. Smaller versions. When he accidentally made his hair grow back overnight after Petunia sheared it. when the glass front of the snake enclosure at the zoo had vanished in a way that still made him smile when he thought about it. This was those things, but enormous. This was those things waiting. He kept walking. He didn't let any of it show on his face, because showing things on his face at the Dursleys was how they got used against you. Gringotts' bank rose at the end of the alley like a statement. White marble, gleaming even under the flat morning sky, with great bronze doors and 2 goblins standing at attention in their red and gold livery. More goblins inside, a vast, echoing hall full of them, working at high counters with that precise, economical attention that suggested every movement cost something and they intended to be paid for it. Harry walked in and the floor hit him like a wall. Not literally. He didn't fall at once, it was more that the world lurched sideways in a way that had nothing to do with gravity. He stopped walking. Vernon, who had been steering him by the shoulder, felt him stop and yanked, but Harry barely registered it. He was too busy with what was happening to him, which was difficult to describe and happening too fast to follow. It was as if the floor, the marble, the building, the place, had reached up through the soles of his worn trainers and grabbed something inside his chest. Not painfully. Not like being hurt. More like being caught, mid-fall, by something that had been waiting to catch him for a very long time, and the sensation of arrest was so sudden and complete that his legs simply stopped working. He heard Vernon say something sharp and angry. He heard one of the goblins make a sound that was not quite a word. He felt the marble against his knees, which meant he was kneeling, and then he was aware of Dudley somewhere behind him making the noise he made when he was about to cry but couldn't decide if it was worth the effort yet. Then the light changed. Harry didn't close his eyes, he was fairly sure he couldn't close his eyes, because his eyelids had stopped responding to him the same way his legs had, but the Gringotts lobby went somewhere else and he went with it. Not darkness. Something older than darkness. Something that had been waiting here, laid in the marble like a foundation, patient as stone, for exactly this. He felt the first one arrive the way you feel a door open in a room you're standing in, a change in the air, a presence, a shift in pressure. Old. Enormously, incomprehensibly old. It didn't have a face, exactly, but it had a sense, something proud and thin and fierce as wire, and he knew without knowing how that it was looking at him the way you look at something you've waited a long time to see. Then the second. And the third. They came faster after that. He understood, in some part of himself that was working beneath the part that was frightened, that these were not ghosts. They were more like memory. Living memory that had been waiting for a vessel, had been sealed in vaults and bloodlines and ancient dormant magic for generations, and now the vessel was here, was him, and they were arriving. Not possessing. Installing. The difference mattered, though he couldn't have explained it yet. The 10th one came last and it was nothing like the others. It was vast. It was the color of old fire. It settled into him not like the others had, those had been weight, significance, presence, but like a key turning in a lock, and everything that had arrived before it clicked into place, and Harry Potter, age 7, felt the full architecture of what he now was assemble itself inside him like a building deciding to stand. He opened his eyes. He was lying on the marble floor of Gringotts. That part was the same. The lobby was also the same, in technical terms, the counters, the goblins, the high vaulted ceiling, the chandeliers, but every single goblin in the building had stopped working. They were standing, or had stepped to the edges of their counters, or in one case had simply frozen with a quill still raised, all of them watching him with expressions that Harry couldn't quite read but that contained, he thought, the same note he'd heard in that one goblin sound when he'd gone down, something between recognition and alarm. Vernon was talking. He'd been talking for some time, apparently, because his face had reached the color that came after purple. Absolutely ridiculous, the boy simply fainted, there is nothing, I demand to speak to someone in charge right now, we are his legal guardians and, Mr. Dursley. The voice came from directly behind Harry. It was not loud, but Vernon stopped talking immediately, in the way you stop when something cold and precise cuts across your frequency. I suggest you step back. Harry sat up. He did it easily, which surprised him. His body felt different. Not bigger or older, not the kind of different from stories he'd read where magic makes people tall and strong overnight. More like, resolved. Like something that had been slightly out of focus had corrected itself. He looked at his hands for a moment. They were still a 7-year-old's hands. Thin, with a scar on the left one where Dudley had pushed him off a fence. Entirely ordinary. Except that the marble under his palms was warm, and he could feel, distantly, like hearing music from another room, the deep structure of the building around him. The wards and the walls. The vaults beneath. The old, careful magic woven into every stone, something Gringotts had been building for centuries, and he could feel it the way you feel a warm room after coming in from cold. He stood up. The goblin behind him was not the tallest or the most decorated, but something about the way the others held themselves relative to him communicated rank clearly enough. Old, by goblin standards, Harry had nothing to compare it to, but he got the impression of great age the way you get it from old trees and old libraries. Sharp-featured, with eyes like hammered copper. He was wearing robes that were a deep, serious red, and he was looking at Harry with an expression of complicated intensity. "Lord Potter," the goblin said. The lobby was so quiet that Harry could hear the particular silence that happened when 20-odd people all stopped breathing at once. "That's not right," Vernon said, from somewhere behind Harry. His voice had changed. The anger was still there, but it had a thin edge of something else running through it now, something that wanted very much to be contempt but kept sliding toward fear. "He's a child. He's a perfectly ordinary, Mr. Dursley." Harry turned around. It was the first time, he would think later, that he'd said Vernon's name like that. Usually he said it in a kind of reflexive reflex, "Yes, Mr. Dursley, sorry, Mr. Dursley, or not at all, which was safer." He said it now the way the goblin had said it, calm and level, and watched Vernon's face do something complicated. "We should talk," Harry said. "But later. You should go." The silence stretched. Vernon's face cycled through several colors. Dudley had stopped pretending he might cry and was staring at Harry with the wide, baffled look he wore when the world stopped making sense. Petunia's hand was at her mouth. "Now, you listen here," Vernon started. "Mr. Dursley." The goblin's voice again, and this time there was something underneath it that was not quite a sound, a low, subterranean vibration that Harry could feel through his feet, through the warm marble, that seemed to come from the building itself. "Your presence in this bank is no longer required. You will be escorted to the entrance. If you return today, our security staff will be happy to assist you in leaving again." 6 goblins materialized from somewhere. They were not large, but they were carrying weapons that made the math irrelevant, and their expressions communicated an absolute professional willingness to use them. Vernon looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him. He wasn't angry. He'd realized, in the last 30 seconds, that he hadn't the same relationship to the Dursleys that he'd had 10 minutes ago, and the change had happened so cleanly that there wasn't even much feeling in it yet. He just looked at Vernon Dursley and saw him, possibly for the first time, clearly, a frightened man who had been given something he couldn't control and had tried to manage that fear with cruelty, and who was now standing in a place where the cruelty had no purchase. "I'll be in touch," Harry said. "About living arrangements." Vernon opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at the 6 goblins. Left. Petunia went without looking back. Dudley followed, trailing crisp crumbs, shooting one last baffled glance over his shoulder at Harry before the door swallowed them. Harry turned back to the goblin. "You called me Lord Potter," Harry said. "What does that mean, exactly?" "All of it." The goblin studied him for a moment. The copper eyes were unreadable in the way that very intelligent eyes were sometimes unreadable, not blank, but calculating, measuring, deciding something. Then he did something Harry didn't expect. He inclined his head, a short, precise movement, and Harry understood from the absolute stillness that fell across every other goblin in the building that this was not a thing that happened often. "My name is Ragnok," the goblin said. "I am the director of Gringotts, Britain. And I think, Lord Potter, that we have a great deal to discuss." He paused. "Are you hungry?" Harry blinked. "Yes, actually." "Good. We will talk better with food." Ragnok turned and began walking toward a door at the far end of the lobby, and Harry, after a moment, followed him. Behind them, 20-odd goblins released their collectively held breath and went slowly, carefully, back to work, with the particular focus of people pretending they hadn't just witnessed something extraordinary. The room Ragnok led him to was small by Gringotts standards, which meant it was still impressive: stone walls, a fire in a grate that burned a deep, comfortable orange, a table set with things that smelled extraordinary. Harry sat down and ate a bread roll and a piece of something that turned out to be roasted chicken and tried to organize what had happened into an order that made sense. Ragnok sat across from him and waited. That patience, Harry would later understand, was a form of respect. Goblins did not wait for people they did not consider worth waiting for. "You said I collapsed," Harry started. "You triggered the Inheritance Rite," Ragnok corrected. "The distinction matters. You did not faint, Lord Potter. What happened to you is a ceremony that the Gringotts Charter designates as the most significant financial and genealogical event our institution can host. It has not occurred in 1140 years. He paused. It has never, in recorded history, occurred with 10 concurrent lines. Harry put down the chicken. 10. 10. Ragnok reached into his robes and produced a scroll, old, thick, sealed with 10 different colored waxes, each one bearing a different mark. He unrolled it across the table with practiced efficiency, and Harry found himself looking at 10 names written in an archaic script that he somehow, without having learned it, could read perfectly. These are the bloodlines that have recognized you as their heir and lord. Each was effectively dormant. The last members of each line either died without known heirs or sealed their line against anyone who did not meet certain, exacting criteria. Harry looked at the list. He could read every name. He could also feel, as he looked at each one, a kind of resonance, like looking at words in a language he'd grown up speaking without realizing it. Peveril. Slytherin. Gryffindor. Ravenclaw. Hufflepuff. Emrys. Le Fay. Flammel. Pendragon. Ptolemy. Slytherin, Harry said. Yes. And Gryffindor. Also yes. I understand the contradiction seems, it doesn't, actually. Harry looked up from the scroll. He was turning the idea over in his mind and finding that it fit, not comfortably, but correctly, the way a heavy thing fits when it's put in the right place. If they both chose me, they both found what they were looking for. They just wanted different things. He paused. What does it mean, to be lord of them? What do I actually have? Ragnok studied him with that measuring look again. Properties. Vaults. Significant wealth, in several cases. Political standing. 10 ancient lordships represent a substantial block of power in the Wisengamot, the magical governing body. But those are the practical elements. He hesitated, which was not something Harry suspected Ragnok did often. The magical inheritance is more significant. Each line carries what we call a legacy, a concentrated essence of that bloodline's greatest magical achievement. Those legacies are now part of you. They will develop as you grow. You will not have full access to everything immediately. But some things already, Harry said, because he could feel them. 10 distinct presences, distinct textures of knowledge and power, all arranged inside him like a library he hadn't catalogued yet. Yes. Ragnok's eyes were sharp. We noticed. Harry looked at the fire. It was doing something slightly odd. The flames were burning steadily, but they kept finding his face, orienting toward him the way a compass needle orients north. He'd noticed this and decided not to mention it. "The Archmage thing," he said. Ragnarok was quiet for a moment. "That classification is not something Gringotts assigned to you, Lord Potter. It is something our instruments measured. We have sensors built into the floor of the lobby, they are part of the inheritance process, and they are incapable of exaggeration." Another pause. "They last registered an Archmage rating in 975 AD. Who was that?" "Merlin." Ragnarok's voice was entirely neutral. "One of your new ancestors." Harry thought about this. He ate another piece of chicken. The fire leaned toward him. "Okay," he said finally. Ragnarok blinked, the first involuntary motion Harry had seen from him. "Okay? I mean, it's a lot." Harry looked up. "I'm not pretending it isn't. But panicking about it doesn't seem useful, and I've got questions that are more practical." He looked back at the scroll. "Where have I been living?" "With your mother's sister." "We are aware." "Right. I need to not do that anymore." "Already in hand." Ragnarok produced a second document, this one more recent, the ink still slightly sharp. "The Potter ancestral seat, Linfred Hall in the Cotswolds, has been sealed since your parents' death. It is fully staffed by house elves and has been maintained in your absence. You are also entitled to Slytherin Manor in Cornwall, Ravenclaw's Tower in the Scottish Highlands, and," he paused, "Emery's Keep in Wales, which we strongly recommend you visit last, as it has an active protective system that kills unannounced visitors and will require introduction." "Good to know. There are also 6 further properties of varying sizes and states of upkeep, 2 of them on the continent. You own." Ragnarok unrolled a third scroll, this one considerably longer, rather a lot. Harry looked at the scroll. It was very long indeed. "Can you manage it?" "All of it. I'll need someone I trust to handle the day-to-day business." The copper eyes watched him steadily. "Gringotts has managed the affairs of the wizarding world's most significant families for a millennium, Lord Potter." "I know. But that's different from asking." Harry met his gaze. "I'm asking you. Personally. I'd like Gringotts, and specifically you, to manage my affairs. I expect to be consulted on major decisions and kept informed of everything." He held Ragnarok's look. "I'll pay fair rates. Goblin fare, not wizard imposed." Something shifted in the copper eyes. Not warmth, exactly, Ragnarok was too old and too careful for warmth to show easily, but something that recognized what Harry had done and accorded it appropriate weight. "That is acceptable," Ragnarok said. "One more thing." Harry folded his hands on the table. He was 7 years old and he had just eaten someone else's roasted chicken and he was sitting across from the director of the most powerful financial institution in the magical world and he said, absolutely without hesitation, "What happened to my parents?" The real version. The fire crackled. Ragnarok sat back slightly in his chair. "That," the goblin said, "is a longer story. I've got time." Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, a different kind of nod than before, not the inclination of respect but something more considered. Something that said I am deciding to trust you with this and meant it. "Your parents were murdered," Ragnarok said. "On the night of October 31st, 1981, by the dark wizard known as Lord Voldemort." Harry had known it was something like this. He'd known for 2 years, in the vague, protective way you know things that are too large to look at directly. Hearing it said plainly, without softening, felt like the glass finally clearing. "He killed my father first. Then your mother, who died protecting you, performed a sacrifice that our curse breakers have never fully categorized. The killing curse rebounded. Voldemort was destroyed, or nearly. He survived in some diminished form. And you," Ragnarok paused, "were left with a scar and a great deal of unwanted attention." The scar. Harry touched it, the lightning bolt on his forehead, which Petunia had always told him was from the car crash. He could feel it differently now. It felt sealed. Like a wound that had healed over something that wasn't supposed to be there. He filed that away and kept his face neutral. And Dumbledore put me with the Dursleys. He did. Why? Blood wards. Your aunt carries your mother's blood. The theory, Ragnar's tone suggested he had opinions about this theory, is that living with her family extended the protection your mother's sacrifice created. But the protection is tied to you calling that place home. Something in Ragnar's voice was very precise. It is, by our assessment, optional. You have 10 sets of ancestral wards, each one older and more comprehensive than anything Albus Dumbledore constructed in Surrey. The protection argument has merit only if you remain defenseless. Which I'm not, Harry said. Which you are, Ragnar said, emphatically not. They looked at each other across the table, and Harry thought that he liked this goblin, this sharp, careful, ancient creature who said true things plainly and waited to see if you were worth saying them to. Dumbledore doesn't know I'm here, Harry said. No. He'll find out. Yes. When he does, he'll want to be involved. Undoubtedly. Harry looked at the scroll with the 10 names. He traced Peveril with one finger and felt something stir, deep and old and patient, like someone waking up slowly in a warm room. How long before I need to deal with that? Ragnar thought about it. You have, at minimum, a week before ministry instruments register the inheritance confirmation. After that, perhaps 2 more days before the information reaches the headmaster. He is perceptive but relies on official channels when it suits him. 3 weeks, approximately. Approximately. Right. Harry sat back. He was tired, not physically, exactly, more the way you were tired after something large had happened and your mind had processed it faster than your body had. He felt the 10 presences inside him, settled and patient. He felt the warm building around him, the deep old magic in its bones. He felt the scar on his forehead with its sealed, complicated secret. I'm going to need tutors, he said. Private ones. The best available. I'll need a curriculum that covers everything I missed and everything I need, and I'd like to start as soon as possible. Within the week, Ragnar said, and there was no surprise in his voice, which Harry appreciated. I'll need to go to my properties. I should establish myself somewhere that makes sense, somewhere with room to work and that's secure without being hidden. I'm not hiding. He said this last thing the way you state a fact. I'm not going to act like something that needs to be concealed. Lord Potter. Ragnar leaned forward slightly, just slightly. I should tell you that the last time anything happened to this degree in our lobby, the magical world changed. Not gradually. Not quietly. It changed the way roads change when a river decides to go somewhere else. He paused. Are you prepared for that? Harry thought about the cupboard under the stairs. He thought about the way Vernon's face went when he wanted to remind Harry of his smallness, the practiced efficiency of it. He thought about Petunia burning letters. He thought about 2 years of knowing, in his quiet, careful way, that the world was larger and stranger and more real than 4 Privet Drive wanted him to believe. I've been prepared for something for a long time, Harry said. I just didn't know what it was. He stood up from the table. He straightened his overlarge shirt, one of Dudley's cast-offs. He'd been swimming in it since last autumn, and he looked at Ragnar and said, "Can we go see the vault? I'd like to understand the full scope of things." Ragnar rose. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at Harry with those copper eyes, and Harry had the impression of something very old and very accurate taking a measurement and finding that it landed where expected. "Yes," the goblin said. "Follow me." The carts were extraordinary. Harry had not expected to enjoy himself, but the velocity of the thing, the screaming plunge into the earth, the heat rising from somewhere below, the rushing dark with its distant smells of stone and metal and something older than both, was genuinely, unreservedly thrilling. He held the side of the cart and felt the wind in his face and grinned, and Ragnar, who was beside him with an expression of professional composure, said nothing about it. The Potter vault was exactly what a vault belonging to an old family ought to be, substantial, organized, and large enough that the edges of it were lost in the dark. Harry walked through it with Ragnar and said little, noting the artifacts with their protective cases, the shelves of books in languages he could now read and some he couldn't yet, the tidy stacks of gold that represented generations of wealth. Then Ragnar led him to an older vault, and then another. They descended deeper with each one, the temperature changing, the character of the magic in the walls becoming something different, denser, more deliberate, more layered. These were the ancestral vaults, the ones that had been sealed and waiting. Each one had its own character. The Slytherin vault was cold and dim and full of things that watched you, but cleanly, intelligently, without malice. The Gryffindor vault was warm and sword-bright, the shelves full of war histories and combat texts and one particular sword whose hilt Harry did not touch but whose presence he felt like a warm coal from across the room. The Emery's vault was different from all of them. It was the deepest, for one thing. The cart descended for a long time before it stopped, and the air at the bottom was strange, rich with the kind of charge you found in the air before lightning. The vault door was stone, not metal, and covered in carved runes that Harry could read with the Ravenclaw legacies' perfect clarity. They were a record, a long, meticulous record of what had been stored here and what it required of the person who entered. He entered. The magic touched him like a wave hitting a shore and stopped. Recognized him. Settled. There was a book in the center of the vault, on a stone plinth, bound in something that wasn't leather. Harry walked up to it and looked at it and did not touch it yet. He could feel what it was the same way you could feel heat before you touched a fire. That is the primary tome, Ragnar said from the vault door. He hadn't come in, Harry noticed. It contains the foundational theory behind Merlin's magical system. It has been waiting for someone who could open it. Can I take it? Everything in your vaults belongs to you. Harry picked up the book. It was warm, and when his fingers touched the cover something flickered briefly in the room, all the cold torches lit at once, with a clean blue-white fire, and then steadied. He put it under his arm. He looked around the vault, the shelves of things, the stacked power of it, the deep quiet that felt less like emptiness and more like stored potential. He was 7 years old and he had just inherited the collected magical legacy of the greatest sorcerer in British history, along with 9 others, and the feeling that moved through him was not quite awe and not quite fear. It was closer to responsibility. A serious, clear-eyed sense of the size of the thing he'd been given, and the understanding that being given something large didn't mean anything unless you were willing to become large enough to use it properly. He walked back to the cart. Ragnar watched him settle into the seat and said, "Well? I'll need a schedule," Harry said. "I want to be established at Potter Ancestral Seat by tomorrow, and I want tutors by the end of the week. I'd like to start with magical theory and wandless work before we get to anything practical. I have a sense there are things I can do right now that more actions request aborted. Write the next chapter now." Chapter 2, 10 Crowns. One had the Cotswolds in early morning looked like someone had painted them and then thought better of stopping. Linfred Hall sat at the end of a long gravel drive lined with old beeches, their roots so thick and deeply set that the gravel buckled around them in slow waves. The house itself was not what Harry had expected. He'd half imagined something cold and formal, a manor house in the magazine sense, all symmetry and keep out and clean lines. What he found instead was a building that had clearly been added to over centuries by people who cared more about comfort than presentation, so it sprawled in all directions with a kind of cheerful architectural honesty, one wing clearly older than the rest, a tower at the east end that didn't quite match anything, and a garden in the front that was so comprehensively alive it had begun to explore the gravel. The house elves met them at the door. There were 4 of them, Tibsy, Moret, Fun, and a very old one called Garm who had apparently been in the hall service since Harry's great-great-grandfather and whose eyes were the pale, settled grey of someone who had outlasted most things. They lined up with a collective expression that was difficult to read because house elf faces were expressive in ways that didn't map neatly onto human emotional grammar, but Harry got the general impression of enormous relief. "Lord Potter is home," Garm said, in a voice like a creaking floorboard. He bowed, very slowly, and the other three bowed with him. "Garm has waited." "Thank you," Harry said, and Garm's ears went upright in a way that suggested thank you was not a phrase he'd been expecting. Ragnarok had accompanied him, along with two of Gringotts' senior curse breakers, a pair of goblins named Sharpthorn and Vault, who hadn't spoken once during the journey but who had spent the entire time examining every surface they passed with the focused attention of people being paid to find problems. They were checking the ancestral wards, they'd explained, because the hall's protective enchantments had been in low-maintenance mode for 6 years and some of them needed attention. Harry let them work. He followed Garm inside and said very little, which was fine because the hall itself was communicative enough. It was full of magic in the same way that old forests were full of years, not loudly, not in any way you could point to individually, just everywhere, in the grain of the wooden floors and the particular heaviness of the curtains and the way the fire in the main hall had lit itself when Harry crossed the threshold, without anyone touching it, the logs arranging themselves into a neat precise blaze that was obviously accustomed to being asked to perform. Harry stood in the entrance hall and felt the house the way he'd felt the Gringotts floor, through his feet, through his hands when he touched the wall, a conversation between the building and the thing inside him that was Peveril and Potter both. He'd slept at Gringotts, in a guest room that was deep and quiet and nothing like the cupboard, on a bed that was so unlike the mattress he was used to that he'd lain awake for 20 minutes simply adjusting to the absence of a ceiling 6 inches from his face. He'd woken early and eaten a breakfast that Ragnarok's staff had organized with terrifying efficiency and then they'd come here, and now he stood in his ancestral home for the first time with the morning light coming in through windows that were learning to recognize him. "I'd like to see the library," Harry said to Garm. Garm led him upstairs. The library occupied most of the first floor's east wing and had the particular atmosphere of a room that had been used seriously for a long time by people who knew what they were doing. 3 walls of floor-to-ceiling shelves, a rolling ladder on a brass rail, a reading table in the center and 2 chairs by the window with the kind of permanent comfortable dent in them that spoke of decades of habitual occupation. Harry's father had sat in one of those chairs. He could feel it, obscurely, the same way he could feel the Gryffindor legacy's warmth when he stood near something that had belonged to it. He pulled a book from the nearest shelf and held it. The Ravenclaw legacy stirred inside him like a compass finding north. He could feel the magical text within it, could feel the way the knowledge was organized, and he understood it would be different from reading before. Reading before had been sequential, page by page, his mind building a picture slowly. This was going to be something else. He opened the book. Read 3 pages. Closed it. The entire content of those 3 pages, a detailed treatise on elemental transfiguration theory circa 1640, was simply there, arranged in his mind with the same clarity as if he'd spent a week studying it. Not memorized in the cramming sense. Integrated. He could feel the spaces where it connected to things he already knew and the spaces where it opened doors he didn't have keys for yet. He put the book back and stood very still for a moment. Then he pulled 4 more books and spent the next hour at the reading table, working through them methodically, feeling the library inside his mind grow in real time. It was extraordinary in a way he didn't have language for yet and he didn't try to find language for it. He just kept reading. Ragnarok found him there at 9 o'clock. "The curse breakers have finished the ward assessment," the goblin said, settling into the chair across the reading table with the ease of someone who'd stopped standing on ceremony. 3 of the outer layers need recharging, a standard 6-year decay pattern. The inner wards are in excellent condition. He paused. The older wards, the Peveril origin work, are completely intact and have strengthened overnight. Harry looked up. "Because I'm here." "Because you're here," Ragnarok confirmed. "Ancestral wards key to the bloodline. Your presence is effectively a power source." He said it without drama, which Harry appreciated. "I also have a preliminary list of available tutors. For names, all security checked by Gringotts." He produced a document. Harry took it. 4 names. Brief biographies. The first was a retired Hogwarts professor, Transfiguration, 30 years experience. The second was a healer who specialized in magical development in children. The third made Harry pause, a man named Aldrich Crane, described as a theoretical and applied runic specialist, former unspeakable, no current institutional affiliation. The fourth was a witch who'd spent 20 years studying in Egypt with the Gringotts curse-breaking division. Crane, Harry said. His politics are eccentric but his knowledge is legitimate, Ragnarok said. He left the ministry under his own power 13 years ago, which in our experience is preferable to the alternative. The healer, Whitmore, is she for the medical side of the inheritance? The development questions? Precisely. What happened to you yesterday was not without physical cost. You are currently in excellent health, but the integration of 10 legacies into a 7-year-old's magical core is not something any healer has encountered before. It would be prudent to have someone monitoring. Harry nodded. All 4. Can they start this week? 2 can start tomorrow. Crane and Whitmore within the week. Good. He set the list down and looked at Ragnarok. I want to ask you something about the scar. Ragnarok went still. What about it? It's not a scar, Harry said. I mean, it looks like one. But there's something inside it. Something that's sealed in. I can feel it the way you can feel a splinter. He kept his voice level, clinical. Is that what I think it is? A long pause. The morning had moved on while they'd been talking and the light in the library had shifted, gone warmer and more direct, coming through the window in a slanted column that hit the reading table and caught the dust in the air. We believe so, Ragnarok said. Our curse breakers noted it during the inheritance scan. It is, in layman's terms, a fragment. A piece of the dark wizard's soul, embedded by the violence of the killing curse's rebound. He paused. It is a remarkable thing to discuss with a 7-year-old. Everything that's happened since yesterday morning is a remarkable thing to do at 7, Harry said. Does it affect me? The fragment? In theory it could influence your emotional states, your connection to Voldemort's remaining consciousness, your magical sensitivity in certain areas. Ragnarok's voice was measured. In practice, it appears that the weight of 10 legacies has effectively quarantined it. Our instruments show it as sealed, inert. Harry thought about this. Can it be removed? Yes. But not now, and not safely. The removal process would require, Ragnarok paused, choosing the technical honesty carefully, a caliber of magic we are still researching. I have had 3 of our most senior curse breakers begin the theoretical work. It is a project for the future. Keep me informed. Harry looked back at the books on the table. One more thing. Voldemort, you said he survived. Diminished. Where is he? Unknown. The Ministry officially declares him destroyed. They are incorrect. Ragnarok's voice was dry. He exists in some vestigial form. There have been indicators, small, unattributed magical incidents on the continent, 2 in Albania, that suggest he is attempting to rebuild. He has not succeeded, to our knowledge. But the trajectory is concerning. He'll try to come back. It seems likely. Then I should be ready before he does. Harry said this not urgently or dramatically but in the voice of someone adding an item to a list that was already well organized. How long do we think we have? If current patterns hold and he makes no significant acquisition of resources or a host body, our analysts suggest 3 to 4 years before he presents a credible threat. That's workable. Harry picked up another book from the stack. I'll have a list of additional questions for you by this afternoon. And Ragnarok, he glanced up. Thank you. For yesterday. For all of it. The copper eyes held his for a moment. Then, thank you, Lord Potter, for asking. Whitmore arrived on Thursday. She was a tall, precise woman with close-cropped gray hair and the efficient manner of someone who had seen enough cases that she'd stopped being surprised by any of them, or so she thought, until she walked into the hall's sitting room, began her diagnostic examination, and within 3 minutes had gone very quiet in a way that was clearly involuntary. "Describe what you're seeing," Harry said, because he'd decided early on that he preferred to know. Whitmore completed 2 more passes of her diagnostic wand before she answered. "Your magical core," she said slowly, there isn't, strictly speaking, a standardized measurement scale for what I'm looking at. The scale we use for children your age goes from 1 to 40. Standard for a child with magical ability is between 12 and 25. I had a student at St. Mungo's last year who measured 36 and it was considered extraordinary." She looked at him over her wand. "You are reading off the instrument." "Meaning?" "Meaning the highest the instrument goes is 60, and I'm not entirely certain that's where you stop." She said it in a tone that suggested she was deciding in real time whether to be alarmed or fascinated, and fascination was winning. "The structure of your core is also unusual. Most magical cores are uniform. A single signature. Yours is," she made a gesture with her free hand, searching for the comparison, "more like a symphony than a note. There are 10 distinct harmonic layers, all integrated, all resonating with each other. Does anything about it look dangerous?" Harry asked. "To me, specifically. No." She said this without hesitation. "Quite the opposite. The structural integrity is remarkable. Whatever happened at Gringotts, the integration of the legacies, was clean. It's as if they were designed to combine." She paused. "There is one anomaly. A sealed region on the forward core, adjacent to your scar. I don't want to probe it." "Don't," Harry agreed. "Gringotts is handling it." She nodded, making notes. "I'd like to check in weekly. If you're going to be doing intensive magical study, which I assume you are, I want to monitor the development rate. Magical cores in children grow naturally, but with 10 legacies accelerating the process, your development will be faster than anything I can find a precedent for. Every week is fine." He looked at her. "Dr. Whitmore. I'm going to be doing things that are unusual. Possibly alarming, by conventional standards." She met his gaze steadily. "I'll adjust my baselines." "Good." Crane was something else entirely. He arrived on Friday afternoon with a battered leather bag, a coat that had seen better decades, and the general air of someone who had spent a long time not particularly caring what people thought of him and was comfortable with that decision. He was 60-odd, lean, with quick eyes and the habitual slight squint of someone who did a lot of fine detail work. He looked Harry up and down with the professional dispassion of a craftsman assessing a commission. "You're the one who woke up the Inheritance Rite," he said. "Yes." "With 10 lines." "Yes." "Simultaneously." "Apparently." Crane sat down in the chair across from Harry without being invited and said, "Show me something." "Whatever comes naturally." Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he turned to the empty fireplace and lit it. Not with a wand, he didn't have one yet, just with intention, the Emery's legacy responding instantly, and the fire that came was the same clean blue-white that had lit the Emery's vault. The logs caught and held. Crane watched this. Then he said, again, with the right wall. Harry turned to the wall and applied the same intentional focus. The Ravenclaw legacy rose to assist, automatically. Runes he hadn't consciously placed began to work themselves faintly into the wallpaper, visible for just a second before the magic settled. A small ward, a basic one, just a single detection layer, but clean. Crane was out of his chair and at the wall before Harry could say anything, examining the runes with his nose 6 inches from the wallpaper. "How old is this notation?" he said, half to himself. "Ravenclaw period," Harry said. 12th century, I think." Crane turned around. His expression had changed completely, the appraising composure was gone, replaced with something that was far less contained. 12th century runic notation, produced wandlessly by a 7-year-old who was doing it, he appeared to be choosing the word carefully, casually. I can also read it, Harry offered. All standard runic systems. The Ptolemy inheritance includes a variant that predates the others by about 400 years. Crane sat back down in his chair, more slowly this time. He was silent for a good while. Then, what do you want to learn? Everything that exists, eventually, Harry said. Starting with foundational theory, wand and wandless, the relationship between intent and effect, the mechanical structure of the older spellforms versus the modern standardized systems. I want to understand how magic actually works, not just what patterns produce what effects. That's not a Hogwarts curriculum. I'm not going to Hogwarts for 4 years. I'd rather not waste them. Crane looked at him steadily. Most children your age want to learn to make things float. I can already make things float, Harry said. I want to know why they float. Silence. The fire crackled in its new blue-white way. Crane reached into his battered bag and produced a notebook so worn it was held together by nothing obvious. We start Monday, he said. 7 in the morning. And you'll need a wand before then. The wandless work is impressive, but there are techniques that require the focusing medium to develop properly alongside the instinctive ability. Otherwise you build bad habits. Ollivander? If you go to Ollivander, the ministry will know by Tuesday at the latest. The man is brilliant and he gossips like a washwoman. Crane's quick eyes met his. There's a woman in Edinburgh. Wandmaker, old school, trained in the continental tradition. She's discreet and her work is better than anything Ollivander produces for standard cases, though for something like you she'll probably need a week. Set it up, Harry said. Crane nodded, and Harry could see the man recalibrating, the professional caution falling away, the genuine fascination taking its place. This was what Crane had left the ministry for, Harry suspected. Not because he was eccentric. Because he was serious about magic in a world that had decided serious was eccentric. The first wandless session happened by accident on Saturday morning. Harry was in the garden with Garm. The old house elf was showing him the grounds with an evident pride that involved detailed commentary on every plant and feature, when the magic moved through him without warning. It wasn't dramatic. He'd been listening to Garm describe the ward stones at the garden's perimeter, the ones the original Linfred had set in the 13th century, and he'd been feeling them the way he felt the house, through his feet, through the ambient awareness that was constantly, quietly present now. And one of the stones had a fracture in it. Small, practically invisible, but the Peveril legacy was particular about boundaries and the fracture was registering as a wrongness, a tiny gap in the structure that sang slightly off-key. Harry crouched in front of it and put his hand on it and the magic moved through him and into it before he'd consciously decided to do anything. The fracture sealed. The stone warmed briefly and then settled. Garm had gone very still beside him. Is it supposed to do that? Harry asked, looking at his hand. The great Lord Linfred could do something like that, Garm said, in a voice that was very careful with its words. But it took him. Garm thinks he was over 40 when he learned it. And he used a wand. A pause. Young Lord is 7. I know. Harry stood and brushed the grass from his knees. Crane starts Monday. I think that'll help with the control side. Garm looked at him with those pale, ancient eyes. Young Lord is not frightened? Harry thought about it honestly. The question deserved an honest answer. No, he said. Should I be? No, Garm said, after a moment. But most would be. Most people haven't been living in a cupboard, Harry said, and started walking back toward the house, leaving Garm to stand by the warm wardstone and look after him with an expression that might, on a human face, have been the beginning of something protective. The ministry's owl arrived Sunday evening. A large, official bird, formal gray coloring, ministry seal on the letter it was carrying. Harry took the letter, thanked the owl, who seemed faintly startled by this, and read it at the kitchen table while Moret made tea. It was from the office of the Wizarding Guardian Registry. It was polite in the practiced way of official letters that were not actually polite, and it expressed concern at the apparent departure of a minor wizarding child from his place of official residence, and requested that the matter be addressed at his earliest convenience, and in the interim he was to return to 4 Privet Drive pending a review of his guardianship arrangement. Harry read it twice. Then he picked up a piece of parchment and wrote a reply. To the Office of the Wizarding Guardian Registry, thank you for your letter. I write to inform you that as of this week I have assumed the lordship of 10 ancient bloodlines, as confirmed by the Gringotts Inheritance Rite. As a result, the standard guardianship provisions applicable to minor witches and wizards do not apply to me. An emancipated lord of a Wisengamot seat is classified as a legal adult for purposes of residence and personal governance, irrespective of age, under the Lineage Sovereignty Act of 1612, which your office can find in the registry's own legal archive. I am residing at my ancestral seat, Linfred Hall, which is warded, staffed, and entirely appropriate. The arrangement with the Dursleys is terminated. My representative at Gringotts, Director Ragnarok, is available to answer any procedural questions. Yours, Lord Harry James Potter, Lord of Peveril, Slytherin, Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, Emrys, Lefay, Flammel, Pendragon, and Ptolemy. He folded it, sealed it, and sent it back with the owl. Moret, who had been pretending not to read over his shoulder, made a sound into the teapot that might have been a laugh. Crane turned out to be, in the best possible way, relentless. Monday morning came in cold and grey, and he was in the library at precisely 7, coat still on, notebook open, chalk in his hand. He'd drawn a diagram on the blackboard that hadn't been there on Friday. It covered the entire board, a dense, interlocking system of notation that looked at first like chaos and resolved, as Harry studied it, into a theory of magical mechanics so comprehensive it made the books he'd been reading feel like cliff notes. Base theory, Crane said. Everything else is built on this. Don't tell me you know it already. I don't, Harry said. He sat down and looked at the board. I've read the standard histories and the Flammel inheritance gave me some alchemical theory, but this system is different. It's mine, Crane said. 30 years of work. The ministry didn't like it because it implies that the statute of secrecy is fundamentally incompatible with the most advanced magical practices, which is true, but they found it inconvenient. He pointed to the board. Read the whole diagram first. Don't think yet. Just read. Harry read. The Ravenclaw legacy processed it with its perfect structural clarity, and the Emrys legacy tested the theory against something older and foundational, and the result was a kind of resonance, not agreement exactly, more like recognition. This was a modern derivation of something that had been understood differently a long time ago, and Crane had arrived at it independently through pure analytical work, which was impressive. The notation in the upper left, Harry said. The relationship between intent and ambient field. You're treating them as separate vectors. They are separate vectors. They're the same thing at a different scale, Harry said. Intent is just ambient field that's been, he searched for the word and found it from the Emrys repository, coherenced. Focused below the quantum threshold. Crane's chalk stopped moving. He turned around very slowly. That is not in any published text, he said. I know. Where did you get that? Harry touched his chest briefly, an involuntary gesture. I inherited it. Another long pause. Crane walked to the chair across from Harry and sat down and said, with the controlled intensity of someone rearranging the architecture of their own understanding in real time, tell me everything you can access about the relationship. In your own words. Don't translate, just describe it. They spent 5 hours on it. Harry talked and Crane took notes with the focus of a man who had stumbled into a library he hadn't known existed, and somewhere in the third hour they had moved from teacher and student into something more reciprocal, Crane's 30 years of systematic theory providing frameworks that gave Harry's inherited knowledge context and shape, Harry's inherited knowledge giving Crane's theory confirmation and extension that no amount of independent analysis could have provided. By noon Harry had a wand appointment arranged for Wednesday and a reading list that was going to require an additional bookshelf. By Friday he had the bookshelf and had finished the list. The wand maker's name was Callista Vane, and she operated out of a shop on a narrow Edinburgh close that most people couldn't see unless she wanted them to. She was small and brown and brisk, with the particular intensity of someone who communicated primarily through her hands, and she appraised Harry with her head slightly tilted for 30 seconds before she said anything at all. "Sit down. Don't try to help. Just exist. Let me work." She spent 2 hours on it. She put various test wands in Harry's hands one after another, watching the reactions with the focused attention of someone listening to music, and most of them did something. His magic touched them readily, but she kept shaking her head. "Most of what I stock won't work for you," she said, not with frustration but with the satisfaction of a problem defining itself clearly. "Standard combinations, core plus wood, you'll overwhelm almost any single pairing. The magic will work but it'll be like trying to pour a river through a drinking straw." She went to the back of the shop and came back with a case that was locked with a different kind of lock than the others. "I've had this in reserve for 20 years. I wasn't sure what I was making it for." She opened the case. Inside was a wand that was unusual. Not dramatically, in the visual sense, 13 inches, a warm dark wood that Harry didn't immediately recognize, with a subtle spiral grain. But the moment Callista held it out and Harry took it, the blue-white fire lit in his chest and the room changed. Every test wand in the shop moved. Adrift, a fraction of an inch toward him, almost gravitational. Callista took a sharp breath. "Blackthorn and ashwood, braided," she said. "Not a normal construction, I don't make these often, the process is complicated. Core is a triple combination, phoenix feather, thunderbird tail, and dragon heartstring." She was looking at the wand in his hand as if it were answering a question she'd had for a long time. The braided construction allows multiple magical signatures to coexist without interference. "I've made perhaps a dozen in 30 years. This one," she paused, "I made it and put it away because I couldn't feel what it was for." Harry moved the wand. A simple gesture, no spell, just intention, and the bookshelf across the room reorganized itself, neatly, precisely, by size and then by subject, the books settling with soft sounds like birds landing. "How much?" he asked. "Nothing," Callista said. "I've been paid enough just seeing that." She paused. "Come back if you need another. You might, eventually, some of what you're carrying might want its own channel." He practiced in the evenings. Crane's morning sessions were theoretical, long, dense, stimulating in a way that Harry hadn't known work could be stimulating. The afternoons he used the library, building the foundational reading that the theoretical work required. But evenings were his own, and he took them to the garden when the weather allowed and to the large room at the back of the house, the practice room, with its stone floors and absence of breakable furniture, when it didn't. The magic was extraordinary. Not in the sense of being beyond him, it responded too readily to feel like a challenge in that direction. It was extraordinary in its depth. Every time he thought he had a sense of the complete inventory, he found another room. The Hufflepuff legacy showed him things about living magic, about plants and creatures and the deep interconnectedness of everything that breathed, that felt less like spells and more like a different way of perceiving the world. The Pendragon Inheritance did something similar but for place. He could stand in the garden and feel the ley lines under the Cotswolds like a pulse, slow and old and deep. He was exploring the Ptolemy layer one evening when Ragnarok arrived unannounced. The goblin came through the flue. Harry had opened the connection that morning on Ragnarok's suggestion, and found Harry lying on the practice room floor looking at the ceiling with his hands flat on the stone beside him. The ceiling was showing stars. Not the ceiling of Hogwarts' Great Hall kind, not a projection. The actual stars, visible through solid stone, because the Ptolemy legacy was showing him the sky as it truly was above this location and his attention was fully in it. "Lord Potter," Ragnarok said. Harry came back. The stars faded. He sat up and found the goblin standing in the doorway with a folder under his arm and an expression that had moved beyond impressed into something more complex. The Ministry, Ragnarok said, has officially filed a guardianship review. The Department for Magical Law Enforcement has also. He opened the folder, opened a file on the inheritance claim. They are not disputing it, yet, but they are investigating. Who's leading the investigation? An Auror called Shacklebolt. Senior, respected, known for careful work rather than politically convenient work. Harry stood up and brushed dust from his knees. He'll find that everything checks out. The Gringotts documentation is comprehensive. It is. What concerns me more is a separate development. Ragnarok paused, which he did when what he was about to say required framing. Albus Dumbledore visited Gringotts today. The practice room was quiet for a moment. What did he want? To review the inheritance records. He was informed that the records are the property of the family in question and that access requires written permission from the lord concerned. Another pause. He was also informed of your current residence. Which you told him. Which is a matter of public record, Ragnarok said, with precision. He now knows where you are. He also knows, he must, from the inheritance information, what you are. He'll come here. I know. Harry looked at the ceiling, where the stars had been. Let him. I've been wondering about Dumbledore. He said the name without particular weight, neither reverence nor hostility, just consideration. I've been reading about him. He's very powerful and he's been making decisions about my life for 6 years. 7, if you count the decisions he made immediately after your parents' death. Yes. Harry looked at Ragnarok. When he comes, I want to be ready. Not to fight him. To talk to him properly. He paused. He's going to have expectations about what I'm like. What I need. I want to be clear about what's actually true. You are 7 years old, Ragnarok said, not unkindly, and not to diminish, but in the way you state a relevant fact. Yes, Harry said, entirely without apology. And I am Lord of 10 Bloodlines, Archmage rated, 2 weeks into a magical education that's already doing things Crane describes as unprecedented, living in my own ancestral home, and perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. He met Ragnarok's copper eyes. My age is a fact, not an argument. Ragnarok was quiet. Then, in a voice that had a quality Harry had come to recognize, the quality that appeared when Ragnarok was deciding to say something true that wasn't strictly required, you should know that what you are doing here, the way you are doing it, is not what we expected. When we thought about what the inheritor of 10 lines would be like, we thought about power. Acquisition. The historical patterns of people who received this kind of inheritance. What did they do? Most of them tried to conquer something, Ragnarok said. Within the first month. Harry looked at him. I'm trying to learn things, he said. Conquering seems premature. Yes, Ragnarok said, and the expression that lived behind his copper eyes for just a moment was the closest Harry had yet seen to something warm. It does. The fire in the grate shifted and the blue-white flame guttered once in agreement, and Harry picked up the folder Ragnarok had brought and sat down and started reading, and outside the Cotswolds evening was settling over Linfred Hall's garden in shades of purple and grey, the old beeches standing their patient watch at the end of the drive, waiting, the way old things wait, for what came next. Chapter 3, The weight of old names. Diagon Alley on a Tuesday in late September had the comfortable, unhurried quality of a place that knew its own rhythm and wasn't apologizing for it. The morning rush, if you could call it that, wizards not being particularly susceptible to rushing, had cleared, and the afternoon crowd hadn't arrived yet, so the alley moved at the pace of people who were browsing rather than buying, who stopped to look at things in windows and argued cheerfully about prices and occasionally stood in the middle of the cobblestones for no reason in particular. Harry moved through it with Ragnarok's junior aide, a young goblin called Ferris, who had been assigned to accompany him with the focused protective energy of someone who took the assignment very seriously. Harry appreciated the intention and had spent the first 10 minutes of the walk gently establishing that he didn't require steering and could manage his own shopping list, which Ferris had accepted with the professional adaptability of someone who was learning. He needed supplies. Crane had expanded the curriculum again. They were into applied magical theory now, the part where theoretical knowledge made contact with actual spell work, and the materials list had grown to include things that Linfred Hall's library stocked in text but not in kind. He also needed a new set of clothes, because he had been wearing Dudley Dursley's cast-offs for years, and this was something he'd decided, quietly and without drama, was finished. The clothes he dealt with first, in a small tailor's shop 3 doors down from Flourish and Blots, whose owner looked at Harry once, took his measure in 30 seconds with a tape measure that worked by itself, and said nothing except, Thursday, before returning to whatever he'd been doing. Harry liked him immediately. The bookshop was next, and he was deep in the back shelves. The restricted section wasn't restricted in Flourish and Blots the way it was at school, it was just shelved separately with a minor ward that checked for identification before it let you through, and his identification, as it turned out, unlocked things that usually required a staff member and a formal request, when he heard the argument. It was coming from the front of the shop. A woman's voice, carrying the careful controlled volume of someone making a point to an employee who was not listening adequately, and underneath it a boy's voice that was lower and mostly silent, the kind of silence that meant the boy had learned that silence was the safest place to be. Harry came around the corner of a shelf and saw them. The woman was perhaps 65, upright in the particular way of old families, not stiff, exactly, but arranged, as if posture were a statement she was making about something. She was wearing robes that were clearly good quality but not showy, and she was holding a list that she was apparently comparing unfavorably with what the shop assistant had just told her. The boy beside her was round-faced and fair, slightly larger than Harry but not older, wearing robes that were slightly too formal for a Tuesday shopping trip and holding a small cactus in a pot with the careful concentration of someone who needed something to concentrate on. The boy glanced up and saw Harry. Harry looked back. The boy had the kind of eyes that noticed more than they were usually given credit for, large and brown and attentive, with a particular quality that Harry recognized because he'd seen it in the mirror, the quality of someone who spent a lot of time watching and waiting and cataloging, because the world had shown them that was the sensible way to operate. The shop assistant was saying something apologetic about the specific edition of magical drafts and potions the woman was requesting being out of stock. Then order it, the woman said. I am not interested in substitutions. The Longbottom family has dealt with this establishment for, the Longbottom family has impeccable taste in bookshops, Harry said, coming around the shelf fully. The woman turned. The look she directed at Harry was the kind of look that had probably silenced most rooms it had ever entered, a sharp, comprehensive assessment that moved from shoes upward with practiced speed. Harry returned it with complete equanimity and watched her eyes reach his forehead and pause. The scar was not something he hid. He didn't put glamours on it or arrange his hair over it. It was there. It was what it was. You are, she stopped. Started again, and the rearrangement was interesting. The imperious manner didn't disappear but it recalibrated, the way it would for someone who had just realized they were in a different conversation than they'd thought. You are Harry Potter. Lord Potter, technically, Harry said, without particular weight on the title. But Harry's fine. He looked at the boy with the cactus. I'm Harry. The boy blinked. Neville, he said, and then glanced at his grandmother as if checking whether the word was going to cost him something. The edition you want, Harry said to Augusta Longbottom, is in the restricted section. Second shelf from the left, halfway down. There are 3 copies. He'd seen them 10 minutes ago. They're not usually accessible without a signed request, but if you ask for the store manager, not the assistant, the manager, and mention that it's for a student, they'll sort it. Augusta Longbottom looked at him for a long moment. How do you know what's in the restricted section? I was just in it. Another beat. You are 7 years old. Yes, Harry agreed, pleasantly. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the shop assistant, except with added complexity, there was the beginning of something that might, in a few more minutes, become approval, layered over a surviving suspicion, layered over a base note of genuine surprise that she was managing with practiced discipline. "You have your mother's eyes," she said at last, which was not what Harry had expected. "People say that. I didn't know her well enough to know if it's true." Neville had been watching this exchange with the fascinated attention of someone watching a street performer do something technically impossible. He still had the cactus. Harry nodded at it. "What's its name?" Neville looked down at the plant, then back up with a flicker of something cautious, the look of someone who had named things before and been laughed at. "Trevor," he said. "Well, this one's Trevor. Trevor the second. The first was, it's a long story." "I like cacti," Harry said, which was true. The Hufflepuff legacy had given him a particular attunement to plant life that he was still exploring, and cacti had a quality he found interesting: they were very good at surviving conditions they weren't supposed to be able to survive. "Does he live in your room?" "The greenhouse, mostly." "Gran thinks." Neville stopped, glancing again at Augusta, but Harry had already looked at her and she appeared to have decided, with the autocratic efficiency of someone who made decisions quickly and stuck to them, that this conversation was fine and she would give it room. "Come look at the restricted section," Harry said to Neville. "There's a section on magical plant properties that has an edition from 1743 that's better than anything currently in print." "I'm not allowed in the restricted section," Neville said immediately, reflexively. "You are if you're with me," Harry said, and walked back toward the shelves, and after a moment, after a glance at Augusta that she appeared to answer with a minimal nod, Neville followed, still carrying Trevor the second. They spent 40 minutes in the back of the bookshop. Harry pulled books and Neville talked about plants with the growing confidence of someone who had been waiting for permission to talk about plants for a long time. He knew a great deal. Not theoretical knowledge, not the arranged, catalogued knowledge that came from studying, but the deep intuitive knowledge that came from doing, from spending hours in greenhouses learning to read the specific language of soil and stem and leaf. He knew when something was wrong with a plant before he could articulate why. He knew which fertilizer combinations were counterintuitive. He knew the names in both Latin and the older magical naming system that most textbooks had stopped using. The Hufflepuff legacy in Harry resonated with this like a tuning fork, and he listened with the particular attention he gave to things that were true. "This is the one," he said, pulling the 1743 edition and handing it across. "The section on magical saturation in root structures, it's before the standardization period, so it uses the old terminology, but the actual observations are more accurate." Neville took it and read the first page. Looked up. "This is, Gran has been trying to figure out why the Snargaluff won't root properly. This says, root saturation threshold is higher than the modern texts assume," Harry said. "The modern books averaged the data across non-magical and magical specimens. This one kept them separate." Neville stared at him. "How do you know that?" "I read fast," Harry said, which was true, and considerably simpler than the accurate explanation. Neville looked back at the book, then at Harry, with the careful expression of someone reassessing something. "You're not what I expected," he said. Then, apparently alarmed by his own honesty, "Sorry. I just meant, what did you expect? Gran talks about the boy who lived like a story. Like something from a history book." Neville's voice was trying to be neutral and not quite managing it. "Not someone who knows about Snargaluff root saturation thresholds." "I've had a strange couple of weeks," Harry said. He looked at Neville. The boy had something in him that was solid and quiet and not yet properly visible because it had been buried under too much careful management, too much "you're not your parents, Neville, you must try harder, Neville, the Longbottom name requires," and Harry could see it the way you could see a good building under bad paint. "How's your magic?" he asked. Neville's face did something complicated. "Slow," he said, after a moment. The word had the quality of something said quickly before it could be dressed up. "Gran says I'm a late developer. The healers say my core is fine but the access is, blocked, somehow. They can't figure it out. He paused. I blew up my 7th cauldron last month. Gran was, it's fine. I'm working on it. Harry looked at him carefully. Has anyone checked your wand? My wand? What wand are you using? My dad's. Said simply, but with an underneath to it, a weight that a 10-year-old shouldn't have had to learn to carry yet. Gran thought it would be, she thought it was a good idea. Tradition, and, Neville. Harry's voice was level. Your wand is the wrong wand. That's why your magic isn't working right. Neville stared at him. What? A wand is a conduit. It has its own magical signature, it was matched to your father, not to you. Using it is like trying to write with someone else's hand. Your magic isn't blocked, it's just fighting the wrong tool every single time you try to use it. He paused. The cauldrons aren't you being bad at potions. They're the wand disrupting the work. The expression on Neville's face was extraordinary, it moved through several things in rapid succession, the way faces did when something long-held shifted. Hope, first, which was immediately suppressed. Then a complicated anger that wasn't at Harry. Then something careful and suspended, like a door that had opened a crack and wasn't sure yet whether to go further. Gran won't, he started. I'll talk to your grandmother, Harry said, and went back to the front of the bookshop, and Neville followed him again, this time with a different quality to his footsteps. Augusta Longbottom listened to Harry's explanation with the expression of someone who had received an inconvenient truth and was deciding whether it was true enough to be inconvenient about. Harry laid it out plainly, the wand-matching theory, the specific disruption patterns it created, the fact that Neville's issues were entirely technical and not native, and the recommended solution, which was a visit to a wand-maker and a wand that actually belonged to him. When Harry finished, she was quiet for a moment. The healers did not mention this, she said. They usually look at the core and the spell work, Harry said. The wand is assumed to be correct. It's a gap in the diagnostic process. Augusta looked at her grandson. Neville was standing very still, Trevor II in both hands, not looking at either of them. Neville, she said. Her voice had changed, not soft, exactly, she was clearly not a woman who did soft, but something that had been tight in it had loosened. Is this what you've been feeling? That it's the wand? I didn't know that's what it was, Neville said quietly. I just knew it felt wrong. Every time. Like I was pushing against something. A silence. Then Augusta straightened, and Harry watched her rearrange something internally with the decisive efficiency of someone who, once convinced, acted. We'll go to Ollivander's this afternoon. Vane in Edinburgh, Harry said. She's better for unusual cases and she's discreet. He wrote the address on the back of his book receipt and handed it across. Tell her I sent you. Augusta took the paper. She looked at Harry with those sharp, assessing eyes and said, You are a remarkably unusual child, Lord Potter. So I'm told, Harry said. She almost smiled. He was fairly certain it was a smile, though it was a small one and was gone quickly. Your mother was friends with Frank, she said. Your parents and mine, our children were close. The past tense carried its weight quietly. It would not be inappropriate for Neville to visit your home sometime, if you are amenable. Very amenable, Harry said. He looked at Neville, who was staring at him with the expression of someone who had walked in to buy cactus soil and was leaving having encountered something that was going to take a while to process. Come any time. I have a very good greenhouse and a library that would make your eyes water. Neville nodded. Something in him had shifted, not dramatically, not the way it shifted in stories when a defining moment occurred and a character transformed. More like something that had been held slightly hunched and inward had straightened, just fractionally, toward the light. The ministry's investigator arrived at Linfred Hall on Wednesday afternoon without prior notice, which was either a test or a failure of courtesy, and Harry suspected both. Kingsley Shacklebolt was large, calm, and possessed of an intelligence that he wore unobtrusively, the way confident people wore things they didn't need to show off. He arrived at the door in official aura robes and was met by Ferris, who had been elevated from shopping companion to general aide, and who escorted him through the hall to the sitting room where Harry was reading. Harry looked up when Shacklebolt came in and took a moment's measure of him the way he always did, cataloguing, assessing, finding the true shape of the person rather than the presented one. What he found was a man who did not have a hidden agenda, which was rarer than it should have been. Shacklebolt had been sent to find facts, and he intended to find facts, and if the facts were inconvenient for someone's preferred narrative, that appeared to be fine with him. "Orr Shacklebolt," Harry said. "Sit down. Do you want tea?" Shacklebolt sat. His eyes had done a quick, professional sweep of the room and were now settled on Harry with the calm focus of someone deciding how to begin. "Lord Potter," he said. "I want to be straightforward with you." "Please," Harry said. "The Ministry's investigation into your guardianship situation is routine. The inheritance claim is extraordinary and will be verified independently, but our preliminary review confirms the Gringotts documentation. I don't expect the claim to be disputed successfully." He paused. "My personal concern is your welfare. You are 7 years old and you are living alone. I am living with 4 house elves, a goblin aide, 2 visiting tutors, and a healer who checks in weekly," Harry said. "I am in better supervised conditions than I was at Privet Drive, which contained 3 people who did not feed me reliably and one of whom locked me in a cupboard." Shacklebolt went still. "The cupboard," he said, and his voice had changed, the official tone hadn't gone but something underneath it had tightened. "Under the stairs. From age 2 onwards, best I can reconstruct." Harry kept his voice neutral. Not to minimize it, but because he had decided that this was a fact he was going to state plainly and without performance. It was true and it mattered and it didn't require dressing up. "If the Ministry wants to concern itself with my welfare, I'd suggest reviewing how a child ended up in that situation for 6 years before anyone asked questions." A silence. Shacklebolt was looking at him with an expression that was working hard to stay professional and was mostly succeeding. "That will be reviewed," he said. "I can promise you that personally." "Good." Harry looked at him steadily. "I don't say this to make things difficult for you. I say it because it's true and because I'd rather not pretend it isn't." He paused. "What does the Ministry need from me to close the welfare concern officially?" "A formal statement, a site inspection confirming appropriate living conditions, and a designated responsible adult contact." Shacklebolt opened a notebook. "The site inspection is," he looked around the sitting room, which was warm and well-lit and stocked with more books than most university libraries, "I think we can manage that quickly. The formal statement is straightforward. The responsible adult contact, Director Ragnarok of Gringotts," Harry said. "Or, if they require a human contact, I'll provide one shortly." He'd been thinking about this. "Aldrich Crane, my primary tutor, is willing to be listed." He'd asked Crane, who had said fine in the tone of someone for whom additional paperwork was a minor inconvenience compared to the magnitude of what he was currently doing. Shacklebolt wrote the names. He toured the house. Harry walked with him, showed him the library, the practice room, the bedrooms, the kitchen where Moret was making something that smelled excellent. The Auror was quiet through most of it, observing rather than performing. In the library, he paused in front of the blackboard that Crane used, currently covered in a progression of runic theory that started at the foundational level and now, 5 weeks in, had reached a complexity level that most Hogwarts 7th years wouldn't encounter. He looked at it for a long moment. "Your tutor's work?" he asked. "Mine, mostly," Harry said. "Crane teaches in the morning. I work through the applications in the afternoon and use the board to organize it." Shacklebolt turned from the board and looked at him with something that was past professional interest into personal. "You know," he said, "I went to Hogwarts at 11, like everyone else. By my 2nd year I thought I was doing well. What's on this board?" He paused, choosing words, this is 4th, 5th year material. And it's been annotated with extensions I don't recognize. The extensions are my own, Harry said. Some of what I inherited gives me context for things that the standard curriculum presents as fixed rules. They're not fixed rules. They're pedagogical simplifications. He looked at the board. I don't say that critically, the simplifications make sense for teaching. I just have access to the underlying theory, which changes some of the conclusions. Shacklebolt was quiet for a moment. Then, what are you going to do, Lord Potter? Eventually. It was a genuine question, Harry noted, not rhetorical, not political, not the beginning of a speech about responsibility. Just curiosity, from someone who was trying to understand the shape of what he was looking at. Fix things, Harry said. The magical world has a lot of problems. I intend to address them. He held Shacklebolt's gaze. I have time and I have resources and I have the Wisengamot seats to make things structural rather than just loud. The only question is what order to tackle them in. Shacklebolt looked at him for a long moment. Then he closed his notebook. The welfare investigation will be closed with a positive finding, he said. I'll file my report by Friday. He was at the door before he paused and turned back. The Longbottom boy, he said. I heard you ran into Augusta Longbottom in Diagon Alley. That she's taking the boy to a new wand maker. Harry waited. Frank and Alice Longbottom were the best aurors I ever served with, Shacklebolt said. If the boy has what they had and just needed the right wand, he stopped. Let the sentence find its own ending in the space between them. Thank you, he said, and left. Dumbledore came on a Thursday evening, just before dark. Harry felt the approach before it happened, a shift in the Outer Ward's awareness, the Pendragon legacy reading the ley lines and finding a new presence on the path to the house. Old magic, powerful, distinctive, a signature that had the depth of decades and the complexity of someone who had done genuinely significant things with their ability. He was already in the entrance hall when the knock came. He opened the door himself. He'd told Garm not to. Albus Dumbledore was taller than he'd expected. Not physically, he'd read enough to have a physical description, but in the way certain people are tall, an impression of presence that extended past the actual measurement. Old, in the way that was different from Ragnarok's old or Garm's old, a human old, worn into the face and hands, with the weight of a great many years and a great many things done and chosen and sometimes regretted. He was wearing robes of deep blue, and his half-moon spectacles caught the last of the evening light, and his eyes were very blue and very sharp and currently doing something complex. He had expected something. Harry could see that immediately. He had prepared something, an approach, a tone, a set of words for a particular kind of conversation. What he was looking at was not the conversation he had prepared for, and the recalibration was happening in real time behind those sharp blue eyes. Professor Dumbledore, Harry said. Come in. Dumbledore stepped inside and looked at the entrance hall, the warm stone, the fire, the portraits of Potters going back centuries, with an expression that was, Harry thought, genuinely moved. He recovered it quickly. Harry, he said, and his voice was warm and measured and carried the particular timbre of someone who was very good at talking to children. I am very glad to see you well. I imagine you've had an interesting few weeks, Harry said. Would you like to sit down? Tea, or something stronger? There was a small pause, the pause of someone encountering an unexpected register. Tea, Dumbledore said. Thank you. They sat in the main sitting room, the one with the comfortable chairs and the fire, and Moret brought tea and then disappeared with the discretion of a house elf who had excellent instincts. Dumbledore looked around the room with those assessing eyes and Harry let him, sipping his tea and waiting. You've settled in well, Dumbledore said. It's home, Harry said. It should always have been home. A pause. Dumbledore set his tea down carefully. Harry, I want to explain, you put me with the Dursleys, Harry said. Not accusingly. Straightforwardly, the way he'd said the cupboard thing to Shacklebolt, "This is a fact, we should discuss it plainly." Blood wards. I understand the reasoning. You believed it was the safest option. He met Dumbledore's eyes. It wasn't. No, Dumbledore said, after a moment. Something in the word was real, not managed, not performed. It was not. I have come to understand that more fully in recent weeks. He paused. I relied on reports from, I should have checked myself. I should have visited. Those failures are mine and I own them. Harry looked at him. He had expected defensiveness or persuasion or the comfortable authority of someone who was used to being the most important person in the room, and none of those things were happening. What was happening was harder to dismiss. Why didn't you? Harry asked. Because I was afraid, Dumbledore said, and the frankness of it was clearly deliberate. He was choosing to be transparent and aware that the choice was visible. Afraid of what you would become if you knew too much too soon. Afraid of the prophecy's implications. Afraid that if I looked too closely at your situation I would find things I would have to act on and that action would disrupt a plan I had been building for years. A pause. Those are reasons, not justifications. Harry let the honesty sit for a moment. He did not soften toward it. He was 7 years old and he had slept in a cupboard under the stairs and he was not going to let a well-constructed apology do the work that time and action needed to do. But he recognized it as genuine and he didn't dismiss it. The prophecy, Harry said. Dumbledore's eyes sharpened fractionally. You know about it. I know about it. I know what it says and what it implies. He'd found it in the Peveril inheritance, not the prophecy itself, but a detailed analysis made by a Peveril scholar in the 1980s who had been monitoring the situation. I know that the version of your plan that made sense assumed I would come to Hogwarts at 11, untrained and overwhelmed, relying on your guidance. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. That plan is obsolete. The silence stretched, and in it Harry watched Dumbledore think, genuinely think, not perform thinking, but actually work through what he was hearing and what it meant about what he'd assumed and built and prepared for. You are 7, Dumbledore said. People keep saying that, Harry said. As if I might have missed it. It is relevant. Dumbledore's voice was measured. Power without wisdom is dangerous, Harry said. Yes. Which is why I have tutors. Why I'm studying theory first. Why I'm building foundations rather than trying to do everything at once. He paused. Power without empathy is what made Voldemort. Power with too many restrictions is what made the people who couldn't stop him. He met the blue eyes. I intend to do neither of those things. Dumbledore looked at him for a long time. The fire moved between them. You are not what I expected, Dumbledore said. No, Harry agreed. What I am is better prepared than what you expected. That should be good news. He let that settle. I'm not your enemy, Professor. I'm not dismissing your experience or your knowledge. I'd actually very much like access to both at some point, when there's mutual trust to support it. But I'm not going to be managed. I'm not going to be kept ignorant for my own protection. And I'm not going to pretend the last 6 years didn't happen in order to make things more comfortable. Dumbledore was quiet. The complexity in his face was visible and real, a man who had been playing a long game with the best intentions he possessed, confronting the reality that his long game had a 7-year-old sitting across from it, entirely capable, entirely clear, and not particularly interested in being a piece on anyone's board. The prophecy, Harry said, says neither can live while the other survives. I intend to be alive at the end of it. The path to that end doesn't require me to be ignorant or dependent. He paused. What it does require is everyone being honest about what's actually happening. Including you. Another long silence. Then Dumbledore picked up his tea and held it in both hands and looked at Harry with something that was the beginning of a different kind of regard, not the protective appraisal of a guardian but the careful respect of one intelligent person for another, one who happened to be 7 and who happened to have the weight of 10 bloodlines behind their eyes. The Horcruxes, Dumbledore said. Harry stilled. He hadn't known that word. He'd known the scar had something wrong in it, had known there was a fragment, but he hadn't had a word for the category. Tell me, Harry said. Dumbledore told him. All of it, the theory, the definition, what he suspected about Voldemort's preparations, how many he believed existed. He talked for 20 minutes without stopping, and Harry listened with every legacy working, the Ravenclaw recording and organizing, the Emrys testing the theory against the deep magical physics it understood, the Slytherin reading the dark magic's internal logic with clear-eyed precision. When Dumbledore finished, Harry was quiet for a moment. 7, he said. I believe so. The diary, confirmed and destroyed, though not by our hand. The ring, I have a lead. The locket, the cup, the diadem, the snake, and, he paused. And one we cannot destroy conventionally, because it is inside you. The scar, Harry said. Gringotts is handling it. They have a removal methodology in development. He looked at Dumbledore. What I'm hearing is that you've been carrying this alone for years. The Order has knowledge of pieces, you've been carrying the full picture alone. Harry kept the sharpness out of his voice with an effort. Not because he was angry, he wasn't, exactly. Because this was the thing that had almost gotten everything killed, the one brilliant man with the complete picture making every decision, and the cost of that model had been paid in people's lives. That has to change. You need a team. People who know everything. Because if you get hurt, or distracted, or dead, the knowledge dies with you. Dumbledore looked at him with those eyes that had seen so much and sometimes used that seeing as a reason to be alone with things. You are suggesting a partnership, he said. I'm stating that isolation is a liability, Harry said. For both of us. He paused. I'll share what I learn. I want the same in return. He extended his hand across the table. Dumbledore looked at the hand. Small, 7-year-old fingers, bearing the invisible weight of 10 bloodlines and the visible weight of a lightning bolt scar. He reached across and shook it, and Harry felt the genuine intention in the grip and filed it carefully alongside the genuine failures that preceded it, because a person was the whole of what they were and not just the best part. There is one more thing, Dumbledore said, not releasing the handshake immediately. His voice was very careful. The scar. I must tell you that removing the Horcrux is possible, in theory, but the process we have theorized is fatal, Harry said. Under your version. The blue eyes sharpened. You have a different version. The Peverell inheritance has a relationship with death magic that goes beyond anything in the standard literature, Harry said. So does the Emrys legacy. What Gringotts is developing draws on both. The preliminary theory suggests that the fragment can be extracted without harming the host because of what my core is now. The fragment is sealed inside something that is actively too large for it to affect. He met Dumbledore's gaze. I am not going to die to end this. I want that clearly understood. Dumbledore released his hand. Something in his face had changed, the complexity was still there but the balance of it had shifted, and what had grown was something that Harry recognized as relief. Old relief, the kind that comes when something you've been carrying for a long time is suddenly, unexpectedly, shared. Clearly understood, Dumbledore said, quietly. They sat in the firelight for a while longer, talking, the conversation shifting to Horcrux locations, to the state of Voldemort's reconstruction, to the Order of the Phoenix and its current activity. Harry listened and contributed and asked questions and gave information, and the exchange was genuinely bilateral in a way that Dumbledore had clearly not experienced with anyone for a long time, and which Harry found valuable in all the ways that access to 70 years of magical knowledge and experience was valuable. When Dumbledore left, 2 hours later, he stood at the door a moment before going and said, I would like to visit again, if you would permit it. Come any time, Harry said. I mean it. But come as someone who wants to talk, not someone who wants to manage things. I can tell the difference." The old wizard looked at him, the extraordinary boy who was not the boy he'd expected, who was not going to need saving in the way he'd been preparing to save him, who was going to need something more difficult and more real than that. And he nodded, once, and walked down the drive between the old beeches, his blue robes catching the last of the evening light until the dark absorbed them. Harry stood in his doorway and felt the ward settle back around the house, familiar and warm, the Peveril boundary sense registering the departure of the foreign presence and relaxing into quiet. Linfred Hall breathed around him. Old stone and old magic and the smell of Moret's late dinner coming from the kitchen, and somewhere above him, in the greenhouse that occupied the hall's tower room, a small cactus named Trevor II sitting in the dark. He stood there for a moment, feeling the size of everything, the 10 legacies, the Horcruxes, the Wizengamot seats, the prophecy, the goblin with the copper eyes and the old man with the sharp blue ones and the round-faced boy with his father's wand and the wrong magic for it. The world was large and complicated and full of people whose lives intersected with his in ways that were going to matter, and the feeling that moved through him in the cool evening air was not the loneliness it might have been 6 weeks ago. It was closer to something that had no name yet, but felt like the beginning of one. He went inside for dinner. Chapter 4. What Dumbledore Didn't Say. The Wizengamot chamber smelled like old wood and older arguments. Harry arrived 20 minutes early, which meant he was one of the first through the tall doors, and he stood for a moment at the top of the tiered seating and looked at the room the way Crane had taught him to look at things, structurally first, then functionally, then for what it was actually doing versus what it was supposed to be doing. The chamber was circular, the seating arranged in concentric rings around a central floor where the business of magical Britain was technically conducted. The seats were high-backed and dark with age, each one bearing a family crest in worn gilt above the headrest, and there were perhaps 140 of them, though today's emergency session had only about 60 members attending. The 10 seats that were his were arranged in a cluster on the upper left tier, nearest the window that looked north. He could feel them, the same way he felt the ward stones and the ley lines and the deep architecture of any place that had absorbed enough magic over enough time. 10 seats. 10 crests, each one worn to a different degree of legibility. The Peveril crest was almost entirely gone, replaced by something more felt than seen. The Gryffindor one burned even as a faded gold engraving, something alert and defensive in its heraldry. He walked to them and sat in the central one, the Peveril seat, which seemed right, and set his folder on the desk and waited. They came in 2s and 3s after that, filling the seats with the shuffling gradual energy of a gathering that expected to be dull but had been called urgently enough to make attendance obligatory. Harry watched them arrive and felt the exact moment the room changed. It changed when the first of them noticed him. An older witch near the bottom tier, mid-conversation with the wizard beside her, glanced up toward the Peveril section on routine habit, probably checking who'd filled the dead seats, if anyone had, which they never did, and simply stopped speaking. The wizard she was talking to looked over to find out what had interrupted her and found the same thing. That small silence spread outward in a wave as more arrivals followed the trajectory of the first 2 pairs of eyes, and Harry sat in his chair with his folder and his notepad and did not acknowledge the wave at all, because he had decided this was information gathering and he intended to gather it cleanly. By the time the session officially opened, approximately half the room had noticed him and the half that had noticed had communicated the fact to the half that hadn't, and the collective attention of the Wizengamot had the particular quality of a room that was trying very hard to look like it was paying attention to something else. The chief warlock was a man called Aldous Folly, who had the formal manner and careful voice of someone who had been running meetings for a long time and was very good at it without being particularly good at anything else. He opened the session with standard procedural language, called the attendance roll, and paused, visibly, when he reached the block of dormant seats and found them occupied. "Lord Peveril," he said, reading from his list, "confirmed." Then, one after another, down the list of 10 names, each with that same fractional pause, each confirmation dropping into the room's attentive silence like a stone into still water. When he finished, the chamber was very quiet. Folly looked up and found Harry looking back at him with complete equanimity, and appeared to decide that proceeding was the safest option. The emergency session was about the Dementors. Specifically, it was about an incident at Azkaban 3 weeks prior in which 6 Dementors had broken their assigned patrol routes and entered the cell blocks of the lower security wing without authorization, and 3 prisoners had been rendered incapacitated in ways that were going to require long-term healer intervention. The Ministry's position, presented by the head of magical law enforcement, a compact, ambitious man called Bartemius Crouch whose argument was aggressive and whose evidence was thin, was that the incident was an isolated deviation and that the current Dementor deployment at Azkaban remained the most effective security measure available. 3 other members had spoken before the floor opened to general discussion, each one broadly agreeing with Crouch with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Then an older lord from the Bones family made a careful procedural objection about the lack of independent investigation, and Crouch shut it down with the practiced ease of someone who had been shutting down procedural objections for years. Harry raised his hand. He did not stand. He did not clear his throat. He simply raised his hand the way you did in a classroom, with the unhurried confidence of someone who had no doubt the floor would come to them. Folly looked at him. Several other people looked at Folly. Folly appeared to make a calculation about what refusing to recognize him would cost versus what recognizing him might produce. "Lord Peveril has the floor," he said. Harry stood. He was the smallest person in the room by a significant margin, and he let the room register this without comment, because the room's reaction to it was informative. The Ministry's characterization of this incident as isolated is not consistent with the incident record, he said. His voice was even and clear, carrying without effort. Gringotts' financial records, which I have reviewed as part of the standard due diligence accompanying my inheritance confirmation, show a pattern of medical claims filed by Azkaban staff over the past 11 years that describes a progressive deterioration in Dementor compliance behavior. 17 incidents in the first 3 years. 32 in the next 3. 51 in the 3 years after that. We are not looking at an isolated deviation. We are looking at a progression. The room was very still. Crouch was on his feet. The financial records of Azkaban are accessible to any Wizengamot lord conducting legitimate governance review, Harry said, without looking at him. As you know. He looked around the chamber instead, making deliberate eye contact in the particular way that Crane had told him a good lecturer used, giving each section of the room the sense that they specifically were being addressed. The question the Ministry is not asking is why the behavior is progressing. Dementors are not animals in the standard sense, they do not develop bad habits through poor management alone. Progressive compliance failure in a Dementor population has one known historical cause. He paused. Saturation. Azkaban currently houses approximately 240 prisoners. The Dementor population is 112. The soul consumption to prison population ratio crossed the saturation threshold approximately 6 years ago, and the compliance deterioration began approximately 6 years ago. He sat down. The room was the kind of quiet that happened when people were doing the arithmetic and finding that it resolved in the direction of being uncomfortable. Crouch said, "The Lord Peveril is 7 years old, the data is either accurate or it isn't," Harry said. "My age doesn't affect the arithmetic." He looked at Crouch for the first time, directly, with the calm assessment he gave everything. "If the Ministry has alternative records that contradict the incident progression, I would welcome their presentation. If it doesn't, I'd suggest that the most urgent business of this session isn't defending the current system but figuring out an alternative." Silence. Folly said, carefully, "The Lord Peveril's data will be entered into the session record. The chair suggests that an independent investigation subcommittee, I'll serve on it," said the Bones representative, immediately. "As will I," said 2 others, nearly simultaneously. Crouch sat down with the compressed fury of someone who had just had the floor of a well-managed room removed from under him and couldn't identify the exact moment it had happened. Harry wrote one line in his notepad, "Crouch, watch him," and closed it. Amelia Bones found him in the corridor afterward. She was direct, broad-shouldered, monocle-wearing in the way of someone who had decided decades ago that a monocle was practical and had never revisited that decision. She shook his hand with the grip of someone who had been shaking hands seriously since before he was born and said, "That was either very brave or very well prepared." "Both, hopefully," Harry said. "The Dementor data," she said. "How long did that take you to compile?" 2 evenings. The records are all in the Gringotts archive, they just haven't been cross-referenced against the incident reports before because no one with access to both had thought to look. Bones studied him. She had the quality, Harry noted, of someone who made genuine assessments rather than convenient ones, which made her valuable and probably made her life occasionally difficult. "Your seats have been empty for over a century, most of them. Before that they were held by people who," she paused, choosing words, "were not primarily interested in the governance function. I'm aware. 10 blocks of seats, allied, represent a significant voting plurality in a chamber that has been in habitual deadlock for 20 years, she said. Not as information he didn't have. As acknowledgement of something they both understood. People are going to try to court you. Loudly and with increasingly creative arguments. I know. What will you do? Vote on the merit of each issue individually, Harry said. I'm not interested in alliances that are primarily about power positioning. I'm interested in the magical world being in better condition when I'm grown than it is now. He paused. Which it currently isn't. Bones looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with the economy of someone who didn't waste words, "Come to dinner sometime. I have a niece. She's your age. She also has opinions." "I'd like that," Harry said. She walked away, and Harry put her on the list in his mind, the growing inventory of people who were real, who saw things as they were, who could be worked with. It was getting longer, which was encouraging. He found Neville waiting outside the ministry's visitors' entrance at the bottom of the telephone box. This had not been planned. Neville was there with his grandmother, who appeared to be delivering him somewhere and whose expression when she saw Harry shift from mild surprise to something more calculated told Harry that it possibly had been planned, just not by Neville. "Gran said we might run into you," Neville said, with the apologetic air of someone who suspected a setup but hadn't been consulted. He was wearing different robes, not the formal ones from Diagon Alley but something more comfortable, and the difference in how he carried himself was small but visible. 2 weeks had passed since their meeting. She said the Wisengamot thing was today. It was, Harry said. How's the new wand? Neville's face changed completely. It was the same transformation Harry had seen starting in the bookshop, but further along now, the cautious inward quality giving way to something more direct and alive. He pulled it from his robes and held it out with the unconscious pride of someone who had found a right fit they hadn't known they were missing. 11 inches, cherry wood, single core. Harry felt the magical signature of it immediately, clean and suited and utterly different from the muffled, fighting quality of the wand that hadn't been his. She took 3 hours, Neville said, meaning vain. She kept putting them in my hand and then shaking her head. And then she came back with this one and, he paused, and the word he didn't say was something about what it had felt like to hold something that was finally right. Harry had felt that in Edinburgh with his own wand and he recognized the not saying of it. Has it changed the work? Harry asked. Everything changed, Neville said plainly. The cauldron didn't explode last week. And he stopped. Started again, more quietly, I grew the mandrake. The one Gran's been trying to propagate for 2 years. It happened, when I was working with it. It just worked. Augusta, who had maintained a perfect impression of not listening from 6 feet away, made a sound that was technically about something else and contained, underneath, something warm and fierce that she was not going to put into words in a ministry corridor. Come to Linfred Hall, Harry said. Saturday. I want to show you the greenhouse. There's a venomous tentacula that needs someone who knows what they're doing with it and I'm better with theory than with the actual plants. Neville looked at Augusta. Augusta made a small precise gesture that meant yes. Saturday, Neville agreed, and grinned, a real grin, sudden and unguarded, the kind you couldn't produce on demand. Do you have a broom? Can we fly? I don't have a broom yet, Harry said. We could get one. Gran won't let me, my property, my rules, Harry said. Augusta, he looked at her with the direct courtesy that she seemed to prefer to performative deference, I'd like to get Neville a broom. For use at Linfred Hall, with appropriate wards. He can make the decision himself about whether he wants to. Augusta Longbottom looked at her grandson and then at Harry and said, with the tone of someone closing a bureaucratic argument with elegant precision, on your property, under your wards, I believe that is within your discretion, Lord Potter. And then, to Neville, something private, said too quietly for Harry to hear, and whatever it was made Neville's ears go slightly pink. The thing about Voldemort was that his presence was quiet until it wasn't. Harry felt the first serious probe 3 weeks after the Wisengamot session. He was in the practice room at 11 at night, later than he usually worked, but Crane had opened a new line of inquiry that afternoon that he'd been unable to put down, when the ward on his scar moved. Not the building's wards. The scar itself. The Horcrux fragment was sealed, as Ragnarok had confirmed, but sealed did not mean inert in absolute terms. It was more like a one-way glass, the fragment couldn't reach him, couldn't influence him, but Harry was aware of it in the peripheral way you were aware of something covered in the corner of a room. And tonight the something covered was slightly less still than usual. He sat down on the practice room floor and turned his attention to it, not poking, not engaging, just observing with the careful distant focus that was a Slytherin legacy skill and that was exactly calibrated for this kind of work. There was a consciousness on the other side of the glass. Not fully formed. Ragnarok had described it correctly, diminished, vestigial, existing in the way something exists when it is mostly not what it used to be. But not nothing. There was intelligence in it, and that intelligence was currently pushing against the sealed boundary of the fragment with the deliberate, testing quality of someone checking the edges of a locked door. Harry watched it test. He kept himself very still and very neutral, because the Slytherin legacy was clear on the principle, you don't reveal what you know to something that doesn't know you know it. Voldemort, or the remnant of Voldemort, the ghost of a person who had made too many terrible choices, was learning that something had changed. The fragment that was meant to be safely embedded, quietly leaking influence, was silent and sealed and surrounded by something that felt nothing like an ordinary 7-year-old's magical core. It was probing because it was confused. Because the world had changed in a way it couldn't account for and it was trying to gather information. Harry let it probe for a moment more and then, with deliberate precision, the Peveril legacy rose in him like a tide, not aggressively, not in challenge, just present. I see you. I know you are there. And I am not afraid of you. The probing stopped immediately. The silence that replaced it was different from before, not the routine silence of a sealed fragment but the specific silence of something that had encountered unexpected information and was deciding what to do with it. Harry could feel it through the glass, alarm. Genuine alarm, the kind that came from something that had been certain of its dominance suddenly finding itself uncertain. Good, Harry thought. He went back to his runic theory. He told Dumbledore the next morning. He'd established a communication line through the Floo. Dumbledore visited every 2 weeks, but they exchanged written notes more frequently, and the notes had the quality of a correspondence between two people who had decided that being genuinely useful to each other was worth whatever adjustments it required. This note was brief: V made contact through the scar fragment last night. Probing, not a full reach. I observed without engaging. He knows something has changed, not what. The interaction was approximately 40 seconds. No lasting effect on the seal. Gringotts notified. Dumbledore's reply came within the hour. This development is both concerning and informative. His ability to probe suggests he has either made significant progress in rebuilding or found a temporary host. Albania remains the most likely location. I will activate the Order's Eastern network. Thank you for informing me immediately. This is exactly the kind of intelligence that makes the difference. A pause in the writing. Harry could tell from the slightly different pressure of the next line that it had been added separately. "How are you?" Harry smiled at that last part, slightly, in the way you smiled at something that was trying. He wrote back, "Fine. Unsettled in a way I don't want to be unsettled, but managing. Working through it." He paused, then added, "Come Thursday if you can. I want to show you something I've been developing on the Horcrux extraction method." Whitmore and Crane have both reviewed it. The reply, "Thursday. I'll bring ginger newts." Crane arrived Monday morning looking like someone who had not slept and was pleased about it. He threw a sheaf of papers onto the table before Harry had finished his tea and said, "Read this." Quickly. Harry read it. It was dense, a theoretical framework for what Crane was calling architectural intent layering, a method of embedding multiple simultaneous spellworks into a single cohesive structure that could operate independently once activated. The underlying theory was Crane's own, derived from his foundational system, but the applications listed were extraordinary: self-reinforcing wards, combat arrays that responded to changing conditions without caster input, diagnostic structures that updated themselves. "This is from last night?" Harry asked. "From our work over the last month," Crane said, pulling his chair out and sitting with the energy of someone who had more to say than sitting would allow. "You've been extending my foundational theory in the sessions, the things you added last week about coherenced intent fields. I ran them through the full model overnight." He tapped the papers. "The implications are significant." "The combat applications," Harry said. "Yes. A ward array built on this principle wouldn't need a caster in the field once it was set. It would adapt. Something like Hogwarts protections but portable and responsive." Crane paused. "And faster. Significantly faster." Harry looked at the framework carefully. The Ravenclaw legacy ran through it with its perfect structural clarity, finding the connections, testing the load-bearing assumptions, noting where the theory was solid and where it had gaps. The Emery's legacy did something different. It took the whole structure and compared it against something older, some deep foundational understanding of how magic actually behaved at its most fundamental level. "The gaps are here," Harry said, marking 3 points on the framework with his quill. "The coherencing assumes a uniform field, but magic fields aren't uniform, they have nodal variations. Especially in places with high ambient background." He paused. "The Ptolemy inheritance has something relevant. Stellar positioning affects field uniformity in ways that astronomical magic has been mapping for centuries." Crane stared at the marked points. "If you can close those gaps, it would make the whole system functionally complete," Harry said. "Let's work through it." They spent 5 hours on it. By the afternoon it was no longer a theoretical framework but something closer to a methodology: coherent, gap-filled, testable. Crane sat back at the end of it and looked at his blackboard with the expression of someone seeing something for the first time that they'd been building toward for 20 years. "I need to think about whether to publish," he said. "Publish," Harry said immediately. Crane looked at him. "The Ministry will. The Ministry's opinion of your work," Harry said, "is not an argument. Publish it. Make it available. Let other people build on it." He paused. "Knowledge that sits in a room with 2 people in it isn't doing its job." Crane looked at him for a long moment. "You know," he said, "the Emery's legacy's most famous characteristic was always the generosity with power. Merlin gave away more knowledge in a lifetime than most traditions accumulated in centuries." He looked back at the board. "I wondered if that would carry through. Does it matter if it's the legacy or just how I think?" Harry asked. "Not really," Crane said, and started making notes on the publication draft. Thursday came in on a front of cold October air, the beaches in the drive stripped down to their bones now, the gravel wet and dark. Dumbledore arrived punctually, carrying ginger newts in a paper bag and wearing a slightly less formal set of robes than usual, and Harry noticed this, the small calibration, the slight relaxation of presentation, and understood it as something genuine. They sat in the library. Dumbledore ate ginger newts and looked at the blackboard and asked two very precise questions about Crane's framework that confirmed he'd been following the notes Harry sent. Then Harry put a folder on the table. Horcrux extraction methodology, he said. Draft version. 3 contributors, Ragnarok's team, Whitmore, and myself. Dumbledore opened it. He read with the speed and focus of someone for whom reading was as natural as breathing, and his face changed as he went through it, the professional guardedness softening into something that was genuinely absorbed. The methodology was built on 3 principles. First, that the Horcrux fragment inside Harry was now effectively isolated by the weight of 10 legacies in a way that prevented it from influencing his core or his consciousness. Second, that the fragment, being isolated, could be treated as a foreign magical object rather than an integral piece of his spiritual architecture, meaning the extraction wasn't surgery on his soul but removal of something that had never truly become part of it. Third, and this was the piece that had required the Peveril death magic knowledge, combined with the Emery's understanding of magical fundamentals, the extraction could be performed through a specific runic ritual that used the fragment's own energy against itself, pulling it out via the same pathways it had used to enter. The death magic component, Dumbledore said, when he finished. He looked up. This draws on the Peveril archive. And the Emery's understanding of soul mechanics, Harry said. Combined with Whitmore's diagnostic precision and Ragnarok's curse-breaking experience with embedded magical objects. No single component is sufficient. The combination is. The risk to you is present but manageable, Harry said. Whitmore's assessment puts it at comparable to a complex but routine magical medical procedure. The risk of not extracting it is that Voldemort can rebuild his body and then attempt to use the connection. He paused. I'd rather remove it on my terms than have that conversation later. Dumbledore looked at the methodology again. He was quiet for a long time, not the working quiet of reading but the heavier quiet of someone weighing something that had been a fixed terror for years against a new possibility that reframed the whole equation. When, he asked. When Gringotts confirms the ritual structure is complete. Ragnarok estimates 2 months. Harry looked at him steadily. I want you there. Your knowledge of soul magic is the deepest living reference I have access to, and if anything unexpected happens I want the person with the best chance of managing it in the room. Something moved through Dumbledore's face. It was not simple, it had gratitude in it, and the complicated texture of someone being trusted after demonstrating they were not always trustworthy, and underneath both of those something older and more permanent, the feeling of a man who had been alone with this for a very long time suddenly finding that he wasn't. I'll be there, Dumbledore said. Then, because it was Dumbledore and he was constitutionally incapable of one uncomplicated honest moment, I want to discuss Hogwarts. Harry had been expecting this. Go ahead. You will be 11 in 4 years. The standard curriculum won't be adequate, Harry said. I know. I was going to say, won't need to be standard. Dumbledore put the folder down and looked at Harry with something that was, Harry thought, the closest he'd come to treating him as an equal. I have been thinking, since our first meeting, about what Hogwarts should look like for someone with your background. There are provisions in the founding charter, very old provisions, never invoked, for students whose prior attainment requires a customized program. What does that look like? In practice, you attend. You have the social and institutional grounding. You also have access to the restricted library without limitation, independent practical sessions, and examination equivalencies in whatever areas you've already mastered. He paused. You would still need to demonstrate proficiency in a standardized way for your NEWTS. But the path to them need not be the same path everyone else takes. Harry thought about this. He thought about what Hogwarts was beyond the curriculum, the people, the structure, the experience of a place that was genuinely extraordinary. He thought about Neville, who was going to be there. He thought about the Wizengamot, the Horcrux hunt, the very long list of things that needed doing, and whether being at Hogwarts would help or hinder. I'll come, he said. On those terms. I'll want a formal written agreement on the charter provisions before September. Naturally, Dumbledore said. And I won't be sorted by the hat in front of the entire school, Harry said. Dumbledore raised an eyebrow. A private sorting, Harry said. Or a ceremonial one after the general ceremony is done. I'm not making the hat's decision into a spectacle. Whatever house I end up in, I'd like to know it without 60 people watching me like I'm an entertainment. A pause. Then Dumbledore said, with something very close to amusement, the hat, in my experience, is not opposed to interesting conversations. A private session is entirely manageable. Good. Harry picked up a ginger newt and ate it. They were good, sharper than expected. What's the Horcrux lead on the ring? And Dumbledore, who had come and prepared for a difficult conversation about futures and found himself instead in a genuine working partnership, leaned forward and opened a folder of his own. They were still talking when Neville arrived Saturday morning on the back of a Gringotts transport with a bag over his shoulder and the expression of someone who had been looking forward to something enough that actually arriving felt slightly surreal. Harry met him at the door and took him straight up to the tower greenhouse, because Neville had barely been inside before he'd zeroed in on the venomous tentacula with the instinctive focus of someone who heard a problem called to them across a room. It's over-pruned, Neville said, walking around it carefully. Whoever cut it back took too much of the secondary growth. See this, and this, he was pointing at things Harry couldn't identify by sight but could feel through the Hufflepuff legacy, the subtle distress of a plant that had been mismanaged. It's compensating by putting all its energy into the defensive tendrils instead of the main body. That's why it keeps going for people. Can you fix it? Probably. Neville crouched down and looked at the root system. I need to talk to it. Not literally, he stopped. Actually, I don't know. Can you literally talk to plants? No, Harry said. But I can feel them. There's a point where it's so specific it's nearly language. He crouched beside Neville. The Hufflepuff legacy. It's your instinct with plants, it's not nothing, Neville. There are very few people who hear plants the way you do. Neville was quiet for a moment, studying the tentacula with that deep, attentive focus. Gran says magic is about bloodline, he said, carefully. She always talks about Frank and Alice. About what they could do. What they were. A pause. I think she worries I didn't get that. What you have is yours, Harry said. It doesn't need to look like Frank and Alice to be real. The silence was the kind that meant something was being processed at depth. Neville kept his eyes on the plant. She wants me to be an Auror, he said. Like them. Harry looked at him. At the greenhouse tower room around them, the green warm light filtered through condensation on the glass, the orderly rows of extraordinary plants that Neville had been moving through with the natural confidence of someone in their right environment. What do you want? Harry asked. Another silence. Longer. I want to work with plants, Neville said, quietly. Magical plants. I want to, I think there's so much we don't know about them. The magical properties, the interactions, the things they can do that we haven't figured out how to use yet. He paused. I want to be the person who figures some of them out. So do that, Harry said. Neville looked at him. It's not, you're 10 years old, Harry said. Augusta loves you. She might have a picture in her head that isn't your picture. But she loves you, and when you show her what you actually are, not what she's been hoping you'd be, she'll see it. She's not stupid. He paused. She's already seen some of it. She stood in that Diagon Alley shop and she let me talk to you about the wand and she got you the new one. That's someone who's listening. Neville turned this over. Harry watched him turn it over and felt the deep attentiveness of the Hufflepuff legacy, the way it perceived things that were alive, not just plants but people too, the emotional structure of the room and the person in it. I trust you, Neville said, suddenly. Then, as if alarmed by the directness of it, I know we only just met. I do. I know, Harry said. Me too. He stood up. Fix the tentacula. Then we'll get brooms. The grin came back, sudden and complete and unguarded, lighting Neville's round face like a window opening. The brooms were clean sweep 7s, not the fastest available, but Ragnarok had made the case for quality over speed for learners and Harry had agreed, and when they flew out over Linfred Hall's back fields in the thin October afternoon light the speed was more than sufficient. Harry had never been on a broom before. He recognized this might be a problem for approximately 3 seconds, which was how long it took him to mount, kick off, and discover that the Gryffindor legacies' combat instincts extended to things moving at speed through three-dimensional space. The adjustment was instant, natural, the broom an extension of intention in the same way his wand was. Neville was less immediately confident, his first 20 feet involved a lot of horizontal wobbling, but Harry had seen how Neville worked and he didn't try to instruct, just flew nearby, and gradually the wobbling resolved into something steadier as Neville's instincts found their feet. By the second circuit he was moving with actual confidence and by the third he was going fast, leaning into turns with the beginning of the ease that was going to become natural with time. They flew for 2 hours until the light went and came in pink-cheeked and wind-scoured and Moret had made hot chocolate, and they sat at the kitchen table and didn't talk much because talking wasn't required and the not talking was comfortable in the way that it was only comfortable with certain people. "I'll come back next Saturday," Neville said. "Come any time," Harry said. "You have standing access. Tell Garm when you're coming and he'll have the greenhouse open." Neville nodded. He was looking at the table, tracing a grain in the wood with one finger, and Harry could feel the thing in him that was still working through the conversation in the greenhouse. "What you said," he started. "About showing Gran what I actually am." Harry waited. "I showed her," Neville said. "Last week. I was in the garden and I was doing something with the soil, I can feel when it's wrong, the composition, and I fixed it without thinking about it, just by intent, and she saw it from the window." He paused. "She came out and she looked at the soil and she said," he stopped. "She said I reminded her of someone. Not Frank or Alice. A cousin," she said. "Someone she was close to who died in the war. Someone who had the same thing with plants." Harry said nothing. "She cried," Neville said. "Just for a second. Then she stopped and she was normal again. But she cried." He looked up. "I think she's been afraid for so long that I'd be nothing that she never thought about what I might actually be." "She's seeing it now," Harry said. "Yeah," Neville said. "Yeah, she is." Outside the kitchen window, the last of the October light was giving up, and the old beeches at the front of the drive were dark shapes against a sky going from purple to black, and inside Harry sat with the boy who was going to be one of his first genuine friends and felt the weight of 10 bloodlines and 10 crowns and the long, complicated future ahead of them settling into something that was still large and serious but was, tonight, at a kitchen table with hot chocolate and someone who trusted you, also manageable. The fire in the grate burned its clean blue-white. Trevor II, in the greenhouse above them, sat in his soil in the dark and grew. Chapter 5, The Girl Who Argued Back. The letter arrived on a Wednesday in February, 2 weeks before Harry's 8th birthday, and it was unlike any other letter he'd received because it opened with a correction. "Dear Lord Potter, I recently read the transcript of your Wisengamot address regarding Dementor saturation thresholds at Azkaban, published in Magical Law Quarterly, Volume 14. Your arithmetic regarding the compliance deterioration timeline is correct and your policy conclusion is sound. However, your citation of the soul consumption ratio methodology is based on Grimshaw's 1987 paper, which contains a significant underestimation error in the baseline calculation. The actual saturation threshold was crossed not 6 years ago but 8, which means the compliance deterioration began 2 years earlier than your address indicated and the current situation is correspondingly more advanced. I have attached my workings. I thought you should know. Yours sincerely, Hermione Granger, age 7, Muggle-born. Harry read it twice. Then he read the attached workings, which were 12 pages long, meticulously structured, and entirely correct. He sat at the library table and felt the Ravenclaw legacy run through the mathematics with its structural precision and arrive at the same conclusion the letter had. Grimshaw's error was in the denominator of the baseline calculation, a substitution that was internally consistent but empirically wrong, and that everyone had reproduced for 6 years because Grimshaw was authoritative and it hadn't occurred to anyone to check. Hermione Granger had checked. He wrote back the same day. Dear Miss Granger, you are correct. I had not checked Grimshaw's original data against the primary sources. I will issue a correction to the quarterly and revise the subcommittee's working figures accordingly. Thank you. May I ask how you access the Magical Law Quarterly? It is not a publication typically available to non-practitioners. Yours, Harry Potter. The reply came the next morning, which suggested she had been watching for his response. Dear Lord Potter, I found it in the restricted section of the London Magical Repository on Charing Cross Road, which is a reference library accessible to anyone with a registered magical identity. I have been visiting since October, when I received my notification letter. I have read most of the periodicals section. I should also tell you that I found 2 additional errors in papers cited by other Wisengamot members in the same session. I didn't write to them because I didn't think they'd respond well. You seemed like you might. Yours sincerely, Hermione Granger. Harry smiled at the letter, which was a genuine, unperformed smile. He wrote back immediately. Dear Miss Granger, you were right about that. What are the other 2 errors? HP. The correspondence lasted 3 weeks before Harry invited her to Linfred Hall, and she arrived on a Saturday morning in early March with her parents, a tall, pleasant pair who had the slightly overwhelmed quality of people trying to be appropriately calm about a world they had discovered 4 months ago was significantly larger than they'd thought. Her father shook Harry's hand firmly. Her mother said, "Lovely home," 3 times in the first 5 minutes in the way people did when they were processing something new. Hermione herself was small, brown-haired, and possessed of an energy that was impossible to mistake for anything other than what it was, a very, very large mind looking urgently for things to do. She walked into the library and stopped in the doorway, and Harry watched her take it in with the expression of someone encountering something they have wanted to exist their whole life. How many volumes? She asked. 32,000, give or take, Harry said. The ancestral libraries from the other properties are being consolidated here. She turned and looked at him. She had brown eyes that were direct and slightly calculating in the way intelligent eyes often were, and she looked at him the way she'd probably looked at Grimshaw's paper before finding the error, carefully and without deference. You're smaller than I expected, she said. You're exactly what I expected, Harry said. She considered this for a moment. Is that a compliment? Yes. All right. She turned back to the library. Can I look at the runic theory section? I've been reading a standard primer, but it contradicts itself in the 3rd chapter, and I want to see if the primary sources are more consistent. 3rd shelf from the right, bottom 2 rows, Harry said. They're more consistent. The contradiction in the primer is from the 1973 edition. There was a printing error that was never corrected, so if your copy is post-1973, the 3rd chapter is wrong. She went to the shelf immediately. Harry sat at the table and watched her move through the books with the natural efficiency of someone who had a very good internal organizational system and had been waiting for a library large enough to justify it. Her parents accepted tea from Moret and sat in the reading chairs by the window with the polite, slightly dazed manner of people who had stopped being surprised by new things because new things came too fast to be separately surprised by. Emma Granger asked Moret, gently, whether the house elf was happy, and Moret, who had not been asked this before, stared at her for a moment and then said, "Moret is very happy, thank you," in a tone that suggested this was a good question from an unusual person. Neville arrived at noon, and the introductions had the slightly formal quality of 2 people who were used to being the most observant person in any given room discovering that there was another one. They circled each other conversationally for about 10 minutes, Hermione asking Neville precise questions about magical plants, Neville answering with the depth that came from genuine expertise, both of them recalibrating as each answer was better than expected. Then Hermione said, "What's legilimency?" because she'd encountered the word in a text that morning and it wasn't in her primer, and Neville said he didn't know, and they both looked at Harry. "Reading minds," Harry said. "Precisely, it's the magical art of entering another person's mind and reading their thoughts and memories." He paused. "I can do a version of it." A brief silence. "Can you do it now?" Hermione asked. Her voice was curious rather than alarmed, which told Harry something important about her. "Only if someone allows it," Harry said. "And it's not like reading a book. It's more like being inside someone's experience. It takes significant training to do without causing harm." "Have you done it?" Neville asked. "Twice, with Ragnarok observing. The Slytherin legacy makes it very natural, but natural doesn't mean careful." He paused. "It's something I'm practicing with significant restraint until I understand it better." Hermione was looking at him with that assessing look. "You said the Slytherin legacy," she said. "That's one of your 10 bloodlines." "Yes." "Slytherin. As in, the founder." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, processing. "And that doesn't bother you?" "Why would it?" Harry asked, genuinely. "Because Slytherin is," she stopped. Started again. "In the books I've been reading, Slytherin is associated with dark magic. With blood prejudice. With the idea that Muggleborns are, those are Slytherin's followers' ideas," Harry said. "Probably not even Slytherin's own, at this point. 1,000 years of mythology growing on top of a historical person's actual views tends to distort things significantly." He looked at her. What Slytherin actually cared about, based on the primary source archive in the vault, was precision and survival. The blood prejudice was a later accretion from people who found it convenient. He paused. "I'm Muggle adjacent on my mother's side. She was Muggle-born." Hermione absorbed this. "The people who follow Voldemort call Muggleborns mudbloods," Harry said flatly. "Yes. And they're wrong in every way it's possible to be wrong about something, empirically, ethically, and practically. The Emery's legacy, which is the most powerful thing I inherited, is named for Merlin, whose parentage was unclear and in at least 2 accounts Muggle. Raw magical ability has never correlated with blood status." He met her eyes. "You are 7 years old and you found an error that every magical practitioner in Britain missed. Blood status is not the variable." Hermione looked at him for a long moment. Something in her had been slightly braced, the internal brace of someone who has walked into rooms before and found that what they were was considered insufficient. It relaxed. "Okay," she said. "Okay," Harry agreed. "Can I see the restricted section?" she asked. The restricted section with Hermione was a different experience than with anyone else, because Hermione engaged with restricted material the way a very precise surgeon engaged with difficult anatomy, systematically, rigorously, asking clarifying questions that were themselves more analytically sophisticated than most people's conclusions. She found 3 things Harry hadn't found yet. A treatise on the history of the Statute of Secrecy that was genuinely scathing about its original rationale. A magical theory paper from 1821 that predated Crane's framework by a century and contained, buried in an appendix, a formulation that was almost exactly Crane's primary insight, which Harry photographed with a documentation spell and planned to show Crane with mixed feelings. And a slim volume on Muggleborn magical theory from 1956 that was not restricted for content reasons but had been shelved incorrectly and forgotten. "This one," Hermione said, sitting at the library table with the slim volume open in front of her and that focused, almost severe expression she got when something was important. "The author is arguing that Muggle-born magic is structurally different from established family magic, not weaker, but different in the way that a river from a new spring is different from a river from an old glacier. More responsive, less channeled. She paused. Is that true? Harry felt through the Slytherin and Ravenclaw legacies, both of which had direct experience of magical structure across different source types. In some ways, he said. The channeling thing is real. Old families have generational habits built into their magical expression, ways of doing things that have been reinforced for centuries and become almost automatic. Muggleborns don't have those habits. He considered. There are advantages to both. The habits provide speed and reliability. The absence of them provides flexibility. Hermione was looking at him with a slightly different expression now, the one that appeared when she was building something in her mind and needed pieces from outside herself to complete it. Then the educational system should be designed for both, she said. Not just one, which is what it currently is. The current system was designed when Muggleborns were considered guests, Harry said. The fundamental structure hasn't updated. Which is why Muggleborn students consistently underperform in early years and then overperform in later ones, Hermione said. The early curriculum is built on instincts they don't have yet. Once they develop equivalent foundations, they exceed the comparison group. I read a study. Harry looked at her. I think, he said, you might eventually want to be on the Wizengamot. She looked slightly startled. I'm 7. So am I. It doesn't seem to be stopping me. A silence. Neville, who had been reading in a corner with the quiet attentiveness of someone listening to everything while pretending to read, made a sound that was the absolute minimum version of a laugh. They were in the garden in the afternoon, Neville in the greenhouse, audible through the open tower window as he talked to the tentacula which had, over the past weeks, become dramatically better, when the attack came. It was nothing like what Harry had read about in the histories. Those described magical combat as explosive, curses and counter-curses, light and sound, the dramatic architecture of a duel. What came across the eastern boundary of Linfred Hall's wards was quiet and old and cold, and it came in through the gaps in the outer ward line with the specific intelligence of something that had been waiting for a gap to appear. Harry felt it the moment it crossed the perimeter, a wrongness, dense and deliberate, moving through the ambient magical field like a cold current in warm water. The Peveril boundary sense triggered first, then the Lefay ward reading picked up the structure of it, and Harry stood up from the garden bench and said, very calmly, Hermione. Inside. Now. Hermione looked at his face and went immediately without asking, which he noted and appreciated. He heard her calling up to Neville as she went inside, Neville, come in, Harry says come in, and he didn't watch them go because he was already facing east and reading the intrusion. It was a creature. Or had been, once. The Lefay legacy recognized it with the specific distaste of ancient blood magic encountering something that had been made rather than born, a constructed magical entity, bound to a purpose, sent rather than come of its own will. It was approximately the size of a large dog in its magical footprint, though what Harry felt rather than saw was a mass of compacted dark intent moving fast through the garden toward him. He didn't reach for his wand first. He reached for the ward structure, the warm, familiar architecture of Linfred Hall's protections, which he knew the way he knew the floor plan of the building itself, and reinforced the inner ring of the garden wards with a focused push of will that the Peveril and Lefay legacies together made clean and immediate. The creature hit the reinforced inner ward and stopped. It pushed. The ward held but flexed, and Harry could feel the strength of the compacted intent behind the push, considerable, professionally constructed. Someone had made this and sent it deliberately. Not a random creature. A targeted sending. He drew his wand. The wand was warm in his hand and the blue-white fire in his chest rose to meet it, and what he assembled in the 3 seconds before the creature pushed through the ward was not a single spell but the architectural intent layer that he and Crane had been developing, a simultaneous structure of 3 working spells, coherence together, that deployed the moment the ward gave way. The first was a containment, Lefay ward work, circular, sinking into the garden earth. The second was a binding, Gryffindor combat magic, clean and aggressive, wrapping the creature before it could move. The third was a diagnostic structure, Ravenclaw origin runic work, reading the creature's composition and construction and the magical signature of whoever had made it. The creature hit the containment. The binding caught it. It thrashed, violent, with the specific mindless fury of something constructed for purpose encountering an obstacle between it and the purpose, and Harry stood 10 feet away and watched the diagnostic structure read it. The construction signature was unfamiliar in its current form but carried traces of the deep dark magic that the Slytherin legacy knew better than anything else, old blood magic, the kind that predated the categorization systems, refined by someone with serious talent and no ethical objections to the work. Not Voldemort directly. Someone working in Voldemort's methodology, which was both more and less reassuring. Harry looked at the creature for a moment. It was still trying, single-mindedly, to get to him. The containment was holding perfectly. He took apart the binding, just the binding, leaving the containment intact, and let the creature move within the circle, and watched how it moved. Direction sense. Looking for the gaps. Not learning, exactly, but adapted, it had been built to find gaps and exploit them. The construction was sophisticated. Then he collapsed the containment inward. The creature ceased. Not explosively. Cleanly, the way a fire went out when you removed the oxygen, the compacted dark intent unraveling from the outside in, losing cohesion, dispersing into the ambient field. The garden went quiet. A bird started up somewhere in the beeches at the front of the drive, startled and then settling. Harry stood for a moment in the aftermath, reading the residue of the creature's magical signature and committing it to memory with the Ravenclaw legacy's absolute retention. Then he lowered his wand and went inside. Hermione was in the library doorway. She had a book in her hands that she had clearly been holding since she came in and hadn't opened, and she was looking at him with an expression that was processing several things simultaneously. Neville was on the stairs. He'd come down from the greenhouse and stopped halfway. "Is it gone?" Hermione asked. "Yes." "What was it?" "A constructed magical entity. Something built and sent deliberately." Harry went to the fireplace and opened the Flu connection to Gringotts. "Ragnarok. I need a Cursebreaker team at Linfred Hall this afternoon. Something came through the eastern wards. I want the breach point assessed and the residue analyzed." Ragnarok's voice came through the green fire with its characteristic precision. "Within the hour." "Are you unharmed?" "Completely. Hermione Granger and Neville Longbottom are here, they're both fine." "Good." A pause. The Eastern Ward Gap, that was the Peveril secondary layer. "It requires your personal magical signature to maintain and hasn't been recharged since autumn." "I know," Harry said. "I should have caught that. I'll update the maintenance schedule." He closed the Flu and turned back to the room. Neville had come all the way downstairs and was standing near Hermione with the solid, quiet presence he had when something had happened that mattered. Hermione's expression had moved from processing to something more settled and direct. "You took it apart," she said. "Not just, stopped it. Took it apart. Containment first, then the dissipation. The constructed entities lose coherence when you remove the binding intent structurally rather than fighting the entity itself." He paused. Fighting it directly would have worked but been slower and left residue that was harder to analyze. "You were analyzing it while you were fighting it," she said. 3 simultaneous working structures, Harry said. The third was the diagnostic. "I wanted to know who sent it." "Do you know?" "I know the construction signature. Not the sender specifically, but enough to narrow it significantly." He looked at both of them. Neville was quiet, that deep internal quiet that meant he was taking in something serious without performing a reaction to it. Hermione's eyes were sharp and her hands were still on the book she was holding. "I'm sorry this happened here. This was not what Saturday was supposed to be." "Don't apologize," Hermione said. Her voice was slightly more clipped than usual, which Harry was learning to recognize as her version of controlled alarm. Is this, she paused, choosing words with the precision she always used, is this what being around you is like? Are we in danger by association? Harry looked at her. The question was genuine and deserved a genuine answer, not reassurance. There's some risk, he said. I won't lie to you about that. What I can tell you is that I take the security of this house very seriously, and that what just happened was a test. Whoever sent that entity wasn't trying to break through my defenses seriously, they were checking what my defenses were. It was reconnaissance. He paused. Which means someone is mapping my capabilities. That's useful information. Who? Neville asked. His voice was steady. Someone with Voldemort's methodology and enough independent capability to construct a sending of that quality. Not Voldemort himself, he's not reconstructed enough for this kind of controlled magical work. A follower. Harry thought of Crouch in the Wizengamot, compressed and professionally furious. Someone with resources and talent and a reason to want to know what I can do. Hermione put the book down on the table. She sat down in the chair as if she'd decided sitting was the appropriate response to this information, and then she said, briskly, tell me everything you know about constructed magical entities. How they're made, how they're detected, how they're countered. I want to be able to recognize the signs if it happens again. Harry looked at her. Then at Neville, who had sat down too, in the chair across from her, with the expression of someone who had made a decision about something. It'll take a couple of hours, Harry said. Good, Hermione said. I'm not leaving until I understand it. The Cursebreaker team arrived within the hour as Ragnarok had promised, 4 goblins led by Sharpthorn, who had the focused brisk manner of someone who liked fieldwork more than office work and was good at both. They went straight to the eastern boundary and Harry walked with them, watching the diagnostic work with the attentive interest of someone learning a tradecraft. Sharpthorn found the breach point in 11 minutes and sealed it in 6. He read the residue with the delicate instruments his team carried and made notes with the efficiency of long practice, and when he was done he handed Harry a written summary of what they'd found. The magical signature was, not a name, but a profile. Someone trained in the pre-standardization dark arts tradition. Someone with access to materials that were restricted under the 1965 Magical Harmful Objects Act. Someone who had used a specific binding methodology that Sharpthorn's notes flagged as associated with a particular school of practice that had flourished in Britain in the 1970s. Death Eater work, Harry said. Sharpthorn's expression was professionally neutral. The methodology is consistent with that school, yes. A current practitioner or a trained one? The freshness of the construction suggests active recent practice. He paused. Maintained skills. Not theoretical. Harry folded the summary carefully. I'd like this cross-referenced against any similar signatures in Gringotts' historical case files. Particularly any cases from the 1970s through 1985. That will take several days. That's fine. There's no urgency, whoever sent this isn't going to try again immediately. They have what they came for. Sharpthorn looked at him. They came for information about your defenses. They came for information about me, Harry said. What I can do. How I respond. Whether I was surprised. He looked back at the eastern boundary, the smooth seamless repaired ward, the garden serene in the late afternoon. I hope it was informative. He told Dumbledore that evening, through the flue, watching the old man's face in the green fire absorb the information with the practiced calm of someone who had been receiving bad news for a very long time and had learned to sit with it properly. The signature is in the profile of the inner circle, Dumbledore said. The ones who were released after claiming Imperius. Several of them still practice. Lucius Malfoy? Harry asked. A pause. Possibly. His technical education was exceptional and his commitment to the ideology remains genuine despite the public position. Another pause, heavier. Harry, this means someone has reason to monitor you specifically. Beyond the general knowledge of your inheritance. They're worried, Harry said. Good. Dumbledore's expression in the green fire was complicated. The concern I have, is that they'll escalate, Harry said. I know. The reconnaissance pattern suggests they'll go from assessment to intervention when they've determined what I am. The intervention will be more significant than ascending. He paused. Which is why I need Gringotts cross-reference on the signature. And why I want the outer ward line upgraded before spring. The upgrade I can assist with, Dumbledore said. Some of the ward work I have in mind draws on, come Saturday, Harry said. Bring whatever ward specifications you have. Crane will be here in the morning and you can work with him in the afternoon. He paused. They'll get along. Crane will argue with you but he'll learn from it. I have no objection to arguments, Dumbledore said, and the slight dryness in it was the warmest Harry had heard from him. Saturday, the three of them were there together for the first time. Crane arrived at 7, as always, and had covered the blackboard in a new theoretical extension before 8. Neville arrived at 9 with the settled confidence that was becoming his normal register, went straight to the greenhouse, and was elbow-deep in propagation work within minutes. Hermione arrived at 10 with a list of questions about the constructed entity incident that was 2 pages long and had subheadings. She handed it to Harry at the door and said, I've been doing research. I want to go through it in order. Good morning to you too, Harry said. Good morning. Can we start with the binding methodology? I found a reference to the pre-standardization school in a 1971 ministry catalogue and I think, Dumbledore arrived at noon, and the moment he came through the door and found 3 children in the library, one arguing with a blackboard diagram, one covered in soil from the greenhouse, one sitting across from Harry making precise annotations in a notebook, his expression did something that it didn't often do, which was simply stop. Not in alarm or assessment, but in a recognition of something that required a moment to take in properly. Hermione looked up from her notebook and saw the old man in the doorway. She stood up automatically, because she stood up for adults on instinct, and then assessed him with 3 seconds of frank examination. You're Dumbledore, she said. I am, he agreed, and his eyes were warm. I have a question about your published paper on soul magic theory from 1963, she said. The footnote on page 47 seems to conflict with the body text's primary argument in a way that either represents a deliberate ambiguity or an editorial error. Dumbledore blinked. Then, with a quality Harry had not seen from him before, genuine, complete delight, the kind that was too honest to be anything else, he said, it was a deliberate ambiguity, and you are the first person who has ever noticed it. Harry watched Hermione's expression recalibrate at speed, the defensiveness that was always slightly present when she said something smart in front of new adults, bracing for condescension, finding something entirely different. She sat back down and said, why was it deliberate? And Dumbledore crossed the library and sat in the chair across from her and began to explain, and Harry got up quietly and went to see what Neville had done to the greenhouse. The greenhouse was warm and green and smelled of soil and something sweetly chemical from whatever Neville had been mixing for the tentacula. The tentacula itself was the most dramatic demonstration of the change in the past weeks, from the aggressive, overwound defensive posture it had maintained when Harry first showed it to Neville. It had opened outward, its main body full and healthy, the secondary growth Neville had identified as missing now filling in with new dark green that caught the light through the glass. Neville was repotting something small on the back bench, his movements careful and practiced. He looked up when Harry came in. How's Hermione? Currently arguing with Dumbledore about a footnote, Harry said. Neville smiled. Of course she is. Harry went to the bench beside him and looked at the small plant being repotted. What is it? Gillyweed cutting, Neville said. I've been trying to propagate from seed for months but the germination rate is terrible. Cuttings work better if you get the root node handling right. He was doing something delicate with the roots, gentle and precisely placed. I want to try cross-cultivation with Didney. The healing properties might compound, the theoretical mechanism is in that 1743 book you found. Has anyone done it? I can't find a record of it. Which either means it doesn't work or nobody's tried. He paused, the particular kind of pause that meant he was saying something carefully. I want to try things that haven't been tried. Not just learn what's in the books. That's called research, Harry said. I know. Neville's hands kept working, careful and precise. I didn't used to think I could do that. Try things that hadn't been done. I thought research was for people who were already good at magic. You're excellent at magic, Harry said. I'm good with plants, Neville said, with the slight deflection that came from a habit of undervaluing. You walked into a greenhouse with a venomous tentacula that my 4 house elves had been avoiding for 3 years, Harry said, assessed its condition in 60 seconds, developed a treatment plan, and over 4 weeks without a single misstep brought it back to full health using techniques you derived yourself from reading one old book. That's not good with plants. That's exceptional at magical herbology. Don't reduce it. Neville's hands stilled on the gillyweed cutting. He was looking at the plant, not at Harry, but something in him had stilled in a different way than his hands, a stillness that meant he was taking something in, really taking it in, not just acknowledging and setting aside. Gran came to the greenhouse last week, he said. She stayed for 2 hours. She didn't say much but she watched everything and at the end she said the Longbottom greenhouse hadn't been properly worked in 12 years. Since Dad. He paused. She asked if I'd come home and look at it. What did you say? I said yes. He resumed the careful repotting. She didn't ask me about being an Auror. Harry said nothing, because nothing was required. Dumbledore stayed for dinner, which turned out to be the first genuinely full table that Linfred Hall had seen in years, Harry at the head because it was his house and Moret would have had it no other way, Neville on his left, Hermione on his right, Crane at the far end with the specific satisfaction of a man who had an afternoon argument with Albus Dumbledore and come out of it having convincingly made several good points, and Dumbledore himself somewhere in the middle, eating Moret's. Cooking with evident appreciation and watching the table with an expression that had entirely abandoned its usual careful composure. The conversation moved the way good dinner conversations did, in directions that couldn't be predicted, pulled by whatever came up. Hermione and Crane got into a debate about the 1821 paper Harry had found that contained the Proto-Crane framework, which became a debate about whether independent derivation was evidence for underlying theoretical truth or just evidence that smart people living in the same intellectual environment thought similarly. Dumbledore weighed in on the side of underlying truth and cited 3 cases from magical history that Hermione immediately challenged on evidentiary grounds. Crane said something that made Dumbledore laugh, a real laugh, the surprised kind. Neville was quiet through most of it but added things at the right moments, precise, grounded observations from someone who had been listening carefully. Harry watched the table and felt the 10 legacies sitting easy in him, not requiring anything tonight, just present. He thought about the constructed entity in the garden. About the magical signature stored in Ragnarok's files, the cross-reference work in progress. About Voldemort's probe through the scar 3 weeks ago, and the quality of the silence afterward, that specific alarm of something encountering unexpected information. He thought about the people at this table and the people connected to them, the shape of what was being built, slowly and seriously, from friendship and trust and the genuine exchange of real things. Someone was watching him. Mapping him. And he was going to find out who before they finished the map. Crane, Harry said, during a gap in the footnote argument. The architectural intent layering system. How close are we to a version that could be embedded in a pre-existing ward network without disrupting the existing structure? Crane looked at him. He understood the question's context immediately, because Crane was not a man who missed things. 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 4 with the theoretical base we closed last month. 4, Harry said. Let's aim for 4. Hermione looked at him. She had the expression she got when she was adding something to a mental map. Is this about whoever sent the entity? It's about being prepared, Harry said, which was true and also an answer to the question. What do you need me to do? She asked. No hesitation in it. No qualification. Just a direct, practical offer from someone who had been here 3 weeks and had already decided what her position was. He looked at her. The 1821 paper, he said. The proto-framework. I want you to trace every published work that cites it, forwards and backwards, and identify if anyone else has been developing in the same direction independently. If someone else has been building toward this methodology from a different angle, I want to know. She nodded, already writing it down. Neville, Harry said. The gillyweed dittany cross-cultivation. Document every step, starting tomorrow. If it works, it needs a published record. Neville looked up. Nodded. Dumbledore. The old wizard looked at him. The ring Horcrux. You said you had a lead. In Little Hangleton, Dumbledore said. The Gaunt family's old property. He paused. I had planned to investigate alone in the spring. Alone is how you get hurt, Harry said. We'll plan it together. The table was quiet for a moment. Crane made a small sound that was not quite words. Dumbledore looked at Harry with the expression that appeared when Harry said something the old man needed to hear in a way he couldn't argue with, and then he nodded. Outside, the February dark had come down fully over Linfred Hall and the Cotswolds, the old beaches invisible in it, the wards settled and warm and intact and significantly more comprehensively maintained than they had been 4 months ago. The fire in the dining room grate was its clean blue-white. Moret brought pudding. The conversation shifted back to footnotes and magic theory, and Harry led it, sitting at the head of the table he was still growing into, listening to the people who had chosen to show up, which was the only kind of choosing that counted. Chapter 6, Lord of what he chose. The Gringotts extraction chamber was the deepest room in the building. Not the deepest vault, the vaults went further, carving through bedrock in their old patient way, but the deepest room designed for people, at the bottom of a staircase that Harry had descended before only in the company of Ragnarok, whose pace on stairs communicated that he considered them a practical inconvenience rather than an architectural feature. The chamber itself was circular, cut from a single piece of stone that the goblins had been shaping and inscribing for 4 months, and the runes covering every surface were a composite, Ragnarok's curse-breaking methodology, Harry's Peveril death magic additions, Crane's structural framework, Whitmore's diagnostic precision, a collaboration carved permanently into stone. Harry stood in the center of it, barefoot on the cold floor because Whitmore had been clear about the necessity of direct contact, and looked at the ceiling. The runes there were the ones he'd designed himself, drawing on the Emery's repository's most fundamental understanding of what a soul was and what happened when part of it was put somewhere it didn't belong. They were not complicated in appearance, which Crane had found interesting. The most fundamental things, they discovered, were usually simple in form. The diagnostic is running, Whitmore said from the edge of the circle. She was watching her instruments with the focused composure of someone who was professionally calm but humanly invested, which was the correct combination for this. Your core reads as I expect. The fragment is sealed. Gringotts, how are you reading? Sharpthorn was at the opposite edge. Consistent with the working model. The containment framework is active. He looked at Harry. Lord Potter. You understand that once we begin, the process should not be interrupted. I understand, Harry said. The first phase will be uncomfortable, Whitmore said, with the honesty Harry had come to rely on from her. The diagnostic runes will activate individually, you'll feel each one as a pressure rather than pain, but the cumulative effect over the first 10 minutes will be significant. After that the extraction phase is different, Harry said, because he knew from the Peveril archive what the extraction phase was likely to feel like and had decided not to describe it in advance because the description was worse than the experience was going to be. Whitmore looked at him. She'd been looking at him that way for months, the particular look of a healer who had been monitoring a patient through something extraordinary and had become, somewhere along the way, genuinely attached to the outcome. Yes, she said. Different. Dumbledore was in the corner. He had been standing there since they descended, silent, hands folded in the sleeves of his robes, his expression carrying the quality Harry had come to associate with genuine difficult things rather than performed gravity. He had said very little since arriving this morning, which was not his natural mode and which communicated better than words that this mattered to him in ways that didn't need elaboration. Ragnarok stood at the chamber door. Not inside, the operational team was Whitmore, Sharpthorn, and 2 other curse breakers, and the chamber design was specific about occupancy, but present, which Harry had asked for and which Ragnarok had agreed to with an efficiency that communicated the same thing as Dumbledore's silence. Harry looked at each of them. Then he looked at the ceiling, at the runes he'd designed, at the fundamental notation of what was about to happen. "Let's begin," he said. The first phase was, as advertised, not comfortable. The diagnostic runes activated in sequence, each one lighting with a deep amber glow that moved from the floor upward in a slow spiral, and each activation was a pressure, not pain, exactly, but something that pressed from everywhere at once, as if the room itself were taking him seriously, examining him with systematic care. Harry stood very still and breathed through it with the occlumency technique the Slytherin legacy had given him months ago, the one that created a clear center of self inside the sensory input and let you observe from there rather than react. By the 8th rune his hands were shaking slightly. By the 12th the shaking had stopped because the pressure had become so comprehensive that individual reactions were absorbed into the whole. Whitmore watched her instruments and said nothing. Sharpthorn watched his instruments and said nothing. The amber light spiraled upward and reached the ceiling and the runes there caught it and held it and the chamber was filled with a warm, serious light that felt older than the stone it shone on. Then the extraction phase began. The Peveril archive had described it as a reckoning of edges, which Harry had found unhelpfully poetic at the time and now found precise. The fragment was sealed, isolated, surrounded by the weight of 10 legacies, but sealed and removed were different things, and the removal required finding every edge where the fragment touched his core and separating them cleanly. The edges were old. 6 years of growing alongside his magic had given the fragment a surface area of contact that was, the archive had warned, more than people expected. The first separation felt like something he'd forgotten he was carrying being put down. The second felt like a door opening in a room he'd been living in, revealing a wall behind it, and the wall turned out to have been doing something structural he hadn't known about. The third was the difficult one. He knew what the third was before it happened, because the Peveril archive had been clear, the fragment that had been in longest contact with his core, the one that had been present since the night in Godric's Hollow when he was 1 year old, had threads in it that went deeper than the others. Not into his magic. Into his memory. The earliest ones, the ones he didn't consciously access, the pre-verbal ones, the ones stored in the body rather than the mind. He felt it separating and he stayed in the clear center of himself and let it go. What moved through him when it went was not grief, exactly. It was something more specific, the feeling of something being removed that had always been wrong, that had always been a wrongness he couldn't locate, and in its removal the clarity of recognizing it as wrong for the first time. Not relief, not yet. Just clarity. The specific clarity of a thing being as it should be. Whitmore made a sharp sound, controlled, professional, but sharp. "It's out," Sharpthorn said. His voice was careful with the weight of something he'd been prepared for not happening and had happened. The amber light shifted. It moved from warm to something cooler and more precise, and in the center of the extraction circle, suspended between the ceiling runes and the floor, something small and dark hung in the light, contained in a Gringotts holding field, the Horcrux fragment, separated, sealed, no longer inside him. It looked like nothing much. That was the strange part. After 6 years of sleeping beside it, of carrying it through every moment of his life without knowing, it was a small, dark, irregular thing suspended in goblin containment gold, and it looked like nothing much at all. Ragnarok said something in gobbledygook from the doorway. Sharpthorn responded. The holding field moved the fragment to a sealed containment vessel that Sharpthorn had ready, and the vessel sealed itself with a sound like a key turning, and then it was done. Harry breathed out. His magical core felt like a room that had been cleared of something heavy that had been sitting in the corner so long everyone had stopped seeing it. The 10 legacies were exactly where they'd been, exactly what they'd been, but the texture was different, cleaner, in the way a window was clean after rain, more purely itself. He looked at the ceiling. The runes were fading slowly from amber back to their carved state, patient and permanent in the stone. Dumbledore moved from the corner. He crossed the chamber with the quick, contained urgency of someone who had been standing very still through something difficult and was now allowing himself to move. He looked at Harry with those sharp blue eyes and said nothing for a moment, just looked. "Well?" Harry asked. "Well," Dumbledore said, and the word had a weight to it that was too full for a single syllable. Everything he wasn't saying fitted into the sound of it. "That's one," Harry said. The ring was already dealt with. Dumbledore had come to Linfred Hall 6 weeks ago with the gaunt ring in a containment case and Harry had pulled the Horcrux from it using a modified version of what they'd just done, the stone itself proving to be a halo which Dumbledore had stared at for a long time before agreeing, wordlessly, that Harry should be the one to keep it. The cup and the locket and the diadem remained. The snake remained. But this one, the one that had been in him, was done. "That's one," Dumbledore agreed, and something in his posture changed, the long-held weight of a particular fear releasing. Harry stepped out of the circle. Whitmore was already there with a diagnostic scan and a quiet efficiency and a hand on his shoulder that was professional and also not, and Harry let her run through the checks and answered her questions and then said, "I want to go upstairs." They came out of Gringotts into a March afternoon that was bright and cold, the sky a clean hard blue over Diagon Alley's irregular roofline. The alley was busy, a Wednesday, mid-morning, the easy traffic of a working day, and Harry stepped out of the bank's shadow onto the cobblestones and stopped for a moment. He felt different. Not dramatically, he wasn't taller or older, he was still 8 years old and over large clothes, though the clothes were better now, the Edinburgh tailor's Thursday delivery having arrived 2 months ago. But the subtle wrongness was gone, and in its absence the world had a slightly different texture, like hearing a piece of music you'd always heard through a wall and finally hearing it in the same room. Ragnarok stood beside him. "You should eat something." "I know." Harry looked down the alley. It was alive the way it was always alive, the moving signs, the calling vendors, the particular energy of a place that was fully itself and not apologizing for it. "I want to walk first." Ragnarok made the small sound that was his version of assent and fell into step beside him, and they walked down Diagon Alley together, the Goblin Director and the 8-year-old Lord of 10 Bloodlines, and the alley went about its business around them with the comfortable indifference of a place that had seen extraordinary things before and found that ordinary days were usually more valuable. They stopped in front of the apothecary's window. Inside, behind the glass, a display of potion ingredients was arranged with the careless abundance of a shop that had more stock than display space. Harry looked at a jar of boomslang skin and thought about Neville's cross-cultivation project, which had worked. The Gillyweed Didney hybrid was in its 3rd week of successful growth, the healing properties compounding in exactly the theoretical way Neville had predicted, and the write-up was 3/4 done and going to Crane for review before submission to the Herbology Quarterly. The cross-reference results came back this morning, Ragnarok said. He'd been waiting, Harry knew, for the right moment. Sharpthorn left the file at the front desk. Harry kept looking at the apothecary window. And? The entity's construction signature matches a practitioner named Rabaston Lestrange. He was released from Azkaban in 1982 under imperious claims. He has been, officially, quiet since then. Ragnarok paused. Unofficially, the financial records show a pattern of materials purchases consistent with ongoing dark practice. Lestrange. Harry filed the name into the same place he'd filed Crouch weeks ago. Not acting independently. Almost certainly not. The entity's targeting parameters were too specific for personal grievance. Someone directed him. Directed him based on knowledge of my inheritance, Harry said. Which means the information about the inheritance leaked from somewhere official. He looked at Ragnarok. The Ministry. The most likely source, yes. A pause. Specifically, someone in the Department of Magical Law Enforcement with access to the Wiesengamacht registration records. Crouch ran the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Harry thought about Crouch's face in the Wiesengamacht chamber, the compressed fury of a man who had built a system that was being questioned by someone 7 years old. He thought about what Shacklebolt had said about Crouch, which was professional and careful, and pointed at the space between what Crouch was publicly and what he was privately. He thought about the Dementor data and the way Crouch had tried to shut down the independent investigation, and the specific quality of his anger, which was not the anger of a man protecting an institution but the anger of a man protecting himself. "I'm going to need to be careful with this," Harry said. "Yes," Ragnarok agreed. "Not because I'm afraid of Crouch," Harry said clearly. "Because I want to do it correctly. Accusation without sufficient evidence in the Wiesengamacht doesn't just fail, it strengthens the position of the accused. I need documentation." "We have financial records," Ragnarok said. "The materials purchases. If the same signature appears in any other incident, pull everything Gringotts has on Lestrange's account since 1982, Harry said. "And I want to see the full registration record chain, who accessed the Wiesengamacht registration for my inheritance seats, and when." "By Friday," Ragnarok said. Harry looked once more at the apothecary window. Then he turned back toward the bank to collect Dumbledore, who had agreed to come to Linfred Hall for the afternoon, and thought about the shape of what he was building, not just the personal safety of it, the wards and the tutors and the magical development, but the larger architecture of it, the way a change in one part of a system moved through all the connected parts. The Dementor subcommittee had its first formal report due to the Wiesengamacht in 6 weeks. The report, which Harry had been quietly shaping through the subcommittee's working sessions, was going to recommend a phased withdrawal of Dementors from Azkaban and their replacement with a system of multiple redundancy magical containment, a system whose theoretical foundation happened to draw significantly on Crane's architectural intent layering framework, now published and generating exactly the kind of independent development Harry had predicted. The Ministry would resist. Crouch would resist loudest. But the votes were there, the 10 seats, the Bones block, 3 independents who'd been persuaded by the arithmetic, and resistance in the face of a majority was noise, not obstruction. He was going to enjoy it. The library at Linfred Hall had acquired, over the months, a kind of character that libraries developed when they were used seriously by people who argued well. The blackboard had migrated from being purely Crane's teaching tool to a shared space where ideas from multiple directions accumulated and intersected, Hermione's research annotations in small, precise lettering, Crane's theoretical extensions in his rapid diagonal hand, Harry's own additions in a notation style that had become, over months of developing it, distinctly its own. Hermione was already there when Harry arrived that afternoon, which was not a surprise. She'd been coming 3 days a week since February, her parents dropping her on their way to their dental practice in London and collecting her in the evenings with the relaxed regularity of people who had decided something was good for their daughter and were right about it. She was at the research table with 4 books open and a notebook covered in the small precise annotations that were her thinking made visible. She looked up when he came in. "How was it?" "Done," Harry said. She looked at him for a moment with those sharp brown eyes that missed less than they appeared to. Then she nodded once, the nod that meant she was satisfied on the most important point and could proceed to the next one. "I found the upstream citations for the 1821 paper," she said. "All of them. And something interesting." He sat across from her. "Tell me." The 1821 paper cites a 1798 paper by a witch named Emmeline Voss, which Crane's published work didn't cite because it's in French and the translation available in British libraries is badly corrupted. She turned the notebook to show him. The original French version, I got a copy from the Paris Magical Repository, contains a complete theoretical framework for intentional layering that is more developed than the 1821 paper. Which means Crane's framework has a much deeper independent derivation history than his published work acknowledges. Harry looked at the French text she'd copied into her notebook. The Ravenclaw legacy processed it with immediate clarity, and the Emery's repository recognized the underlying theoretical approach with the recognition of something that resonated at a foundational level. "This is significant," he said. "It gets better," Hermione said, with the specific energy of someone who has been holding the good part back. Voss cites a 1756 German text, which cites a 1701 Italian text, which cites a 1642 Spanish manuscript. She turned the page. "I haven't gotten access to all of them yet, but the citation chain goes back at least to 1642 and possibly further. This theoretical approach has been being independently derived for centuries by practitioners working across different national traditions." Harry looked at her. "Which means, it's not a coincidence. It's not independent derivation in the sense of smart people thinking similarly. The underlying theory is responding to a real feature of how magic works, and people keep finding it because it's there to be found." She paused. "Crane's framework isn't a discovery. It's a rediscovery. The last time it was formally developed was lost. The 1642 manuscript is in a private collection and the owner won't share it. But the shape of it is visible in the citations." Harry sat back. The implications ran through him in several directions at once. If the full historical development exists, then Crane's current framework, which is already remarkable, is probably still several generations of theoretical development behind where it could be, Hermione said. The complete framework might be in that 1642 manuscript. And whoever owns it knows it. Who owns it? She met his eyes. A private collector in Rome. The manuscript is listed in the European Magical Registry as belonging to an estate called Antiqua Bibliotheca Obscura. She paused. Which is owned by a family named Lestrange. The word landed in the library's quiet like a stone. The Lestrange family has had this manuscript since at least 1642, Harry said slowly. At least, Hermione said. Possibly longer. The 1701 Italian text suggests knowledge of it was already restricted by then. The author describes having seen it once, briefly, and not being allowed to copy from it. Harry was quiet for a moment. The Ravenclaw legacy was building connections and the Slytherin legacy was reading the political structure of what they implied, and the combined picture was something he was going to need time to fully understand. "They might not know what they have," he said. "Or they know exactly what they have," Hermione said. "Either way, we need to see it." Hermione looked at him with the expression that appeared when she'd already thought 3 steps further. "I know someone at the Paris Magical Repository. Well, I don't know her, but I've corresponded with her. She's the archivist who sent me the Voss translation. She specializes in restricted European magical manuscripts." She paused. "She might know how to approach the Lestrange Italian estate." "Write to her," Harry said. "Today." Hermione was already reaching for parchment. Neville was in the greenhouse when Harry went up, as he almost always was on days he came to Linfred Hall, which was 3 or 4 times a week now. Augusta had stopped formally scheduling the visits and started treating them as a natural part of Neville's week, which was its own kind of progress. The Gillyweed Dittany hybrid was in a separate sealed box now, the 3rd generation of propagation, each generation showing stronger compounding of the properties. Neville had added a variable to the 3rd generation that neither of them had initially considered, soil composition, specifically the ratio of magical mineral saturation, and the effect had been significant enough that the write-up had expanded from a short paper to what was shaping up to be a substantial piece of research. "The 3rd generation is doing something new," Neville said when Harry came in. He was standing over the sealed box with the attentive focus he brought to anything that was surprising him in a good way. "The healing activation threshold has dropped. It doesn't need the same preparation process as standard gillyweed, the activation is closer to Dittany's, which is simpler." He paused. "I think the cross-cultivation is producing a genuinely new compound rather than just combining the existing ones." Harry looked at the box. The Hufflepuff legacy read the plants with its deep attunement, the specific language of soil and stem and the chemical conversation of a thing growing, and confirmed what Neville was describing. Something in the third generation had integrated rather than combined. It was different in the way that an alloy was different from a mixture. That changes the medical application significantly, Harry said. I know, Neville said. Standard gillyweed for water breathing takes preparation and timing. If the activation threshold is this much lower, he paused. Healers could use it in more situations. The window for use expands. He looked up. I want to show Whitmore. She'll want to test it properly, Harry said. I know. I'm ready for that. He said it with the simple confidence of someone who had done the work and wasn't afraid of scrutiny, and Harry noted this with the quiet attention he gave to the changes in Neville since October. The boy who had stood in flourish and blots with his father's wand and 7 exploded cauldrons was still in there, would always be in there, but he was no longer the whole story. The whole story had more in it now. Neville, Harry said. The extraction was this morning. The fragment's out. Neville looked at him. He didn't say anything immediately. He had the quality of someone who knew when silence was more serious than words. Are you all right? He asked. Yes, Harry said. Better than all right, actually. He paused, searching for the description that was accurate rather than convenient. It's like a low-level noise that I'd been living with for so long I thought it was normal has stopped. And the silence is strange, but it's the right kind of strange. Neville nodded slowly. Good, he said. That's good, Harry. The word was simple and meant exactly what it said, and Harry received it as it was meant, standing in the warm green greenhouse with the Cotswolds afternoon light coming through the glass and the gillyweed Dibney hybrid growing its new compound in its sealed box, and felt, not the grand complex thing that the last 8 months of extraordinary events might have been expected to produce, but something quieter and more durable. Something that felt like being in the right place. The Wisengamot session 4 weeks later had a different quality than the first one. Harry arrived with 2 feet of documentation and the Bones Block's private confirmation of support and Shacklebolt in the public gallery, which was a deliberate choice because Shacklebolt's presence communicated things that words didn't need to. He sat in the Peveril seat and looked at the chamber and understood, in the clear way the Slytherin legacy read political rooms, that today was different. Today the room was already arranged differently. The positions people had taken in their seats, the conversations happening in the upper galleries before the session opened, the way Crouch had entered and immediately looked at Harry with the specific look of a man who suspected something and was right to. The session's formal business was the Dementor Subcommittee's first report. Harry presented it himself. He stood and read the conclusions clearly and without decoration, the progressive saturation data, the compliance deterioration trajectory, the projection models, the proposed phased withdrawal timeline and the alternative containment methodology with its theoretical foundation. He read for 12 minutes and then sat down. The objections came from Crouch's direction, as expected. They were good objections. Crouch was not an unintelligent man and his arguments for the status quo were better constructed than his Wisengamot position usually required because he'd had 4 weeks to prepare them. He cited security concerns, transition risks, the historical precedent of Azkaban's effectiveness. Harry let the objections complete. Then he asked to speak again, and Folly recognized him, and he said, the Ministry's figures, as cited by the Honorable Mr. Crouch, show a 5% increase in successful detainments in the period of Dementor deployment. The subcommittee's cross-referenced figures show a 47% increase in healer intervention claims for Azkaban's non-target population, guards, administrative staff, ministry personnel, during the same period. He held up the documentation. The ministry's success metric does not account for the costs borne by the people administering the system. That is not security. That is a hidden expense, and the people bearing it are the ones without the authority to change the policy. A silence. Additionally, Harry said, and here the Slytherin legacy's precision and the Gryffindor legacy's directness came together in something very clean, I would like to formally request that the Ministry provide the Chamber with a complete record of access to the Wiesengemot registration documents for the dormant seats claimed this past autumn. There is a matter of document security that the Chamber should be aware of." He sat down. Crouch's composure held. A trained politician's composure, the kind built over decades of practice, and it held. But Harry watched his hands, which were flat on the desk, and noted that the pressure in them had changed. The Dementor report passed, 17-9. A subcommittee to review the registration access was formed, also with Harry's vote among its majority. Outside in the corridor afterward, Amelia Bones fell into step beside him and said, without preamble, "You've been building that second thing for months." "I needed the documentation to be complete before I raised it formally," Harry said. "And it is?" "Ragnock sent the compiled file this morning." He paused. The registration was accessed 3 times between the inheritance confirmation and the entity incident. Once by authorized Gringotts staff. Once by my legal representative. Once by an unauthorized party using a ministry clearance code registered to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Bones was quiet for a moment. She had the expression of someone who had suspected something for a long time and had just seen confirmation of the shape of it. "Crouch won't go quietly," she said. "I don't need him to go quietly," Harry said. "I need the evidence to be sufficient for the process to work. Quietly or not is his choice." She looked at him with those assessing eyes. "Then, you know what you remind me of? Not your father, I've heard people say you're like him, but I knew James and you're not much like him. You remind me of the portraits of Rowena Ravenclaw in the chamber. The old ones, the ones done before the idealization period, when they still painted her as she actually was." She paused. "Strategic and warm. That combination is rare." Harry said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. The letter from Rome came on a Thursday. Harry was in the practice room running through the combat array Crane's architectural layering system had made possible, a self-sustaining ward structure that would respond to intrusion without his active direction, something that had taken 3 months to get right and was now, finally, right in a way he could feel through the full structure of it, clean and coherent and entirely robust. He stopped when Ferris appeared at the door with the letter. The archivist's name was Colette Marchand, and her letter was in precise academic French that the Ravenclaw legacy translated without effort. "Dear Lord Potter, Miss Granger has explained the situation to me with admirable clarity. I have corresponded with the curator of the Antiqua Bibliotheca Obscura on separate scholarly grounds previously and can say with confidence that the Lestrange Italian branch is entirely unaware of what their 1642 manuscript represents. They purchased it from a previous estate sale in 1891 and catalogued it as a historical curiosity. They have received no scholarly inquiries about it in over a century. I have taken the liberty of making a formal scholarly access request on behalf of an unnamed researcher. The curator has agreed to allow inspection of the manuscript during the 3rd week of April. However, given the political situation Miss Granger has described, and the connection to the British Lestrange family, I would strongly recommend that whoever makes this visit does so carefully. I would also recommend that whoever makes this visit bring a goblin. The Lestrange estates are known to be warded against magical intrusion by non-family members, but goblin-recognized authority supersedes family ward structures under the 1689 Treaty of Magical Commerce. If the manuscript needs to be removed for proper study, and I believe it does, Gringotts' formal involvement makes the process clean. With scholarly regards, Colette Marchand. P.S. Miss Granger is remarkable. You should tell her that more often. Harry read the letter twice. Then he wrote to Hermione, Ragnock, and Crane simultaneously, and to Dumbledore as an additional note, and then he went back to the combat array and finished the session because the Italy trip was 3 weeks away and there was work to do in the meantime, and he had never been someone who let future things interrupt present ones. They went in April, on a Tuesday when the Italian coast had the particular quality of early spring, cool and clear, the light on the water something between silver and gold, the old stones of the villa warm in the sun. Harry, Ragnock, Hermione, and Crane. Dumbledore had offered and Harry had said no, because Dumbledore's reputation in European magical circles was significant and conspicuous, and this required neither significance nor conspicuousness. Ragnarok had agreed with this assessment with the efficiency of someone who'd been thinking the same thing. Hermione was beside herself. Not in an anxious way, in the way she was when she was about to see something she'd been building toward intellectually for weeks, a controlled, focused excitement that expressed itself as slightly increased velocity in everything she did, her steps a fraction quicker than usual, her eyes moving faster. The curator of the Antiqua Bibliotheca Obscura was a thin, dry Italian wizard named Salvatore who had the specific quality of someone who loved books more than people and had stopped feeling bad about it. He shook Ragnarok's hand with the particular respect that European wizarding families accorded goblins, which was marginally more than British ones did and which Ragnarok acknowledged with the precision of someone keeping track. The manuscript was in a climate-controlled case in the estate's secondary archive room, not the main library, which was large and magnificent in the way of old Italian private collections, but a side room clearly used for things that didn't fit the main organization. The case was beautiful, old brass and glass, and through it Harry could see the manuscript, which was hand-stitched and leather-bound and showed its age in every material detail. He could also feel it. The Emery's legacy responded to it the way it responded to the Emery's Vault central tome: recognition, warmth, the specific texture of something that touched the same foundational understanding. Whatever was in this manuscript, it was working in the same territory. Hermione had gloves on before anyone else and was looking at the manuscript through the glass with an expression that would have looked extreme on anyone who wasn't her, but on her was simply the appropriate response to something significant. "May I?" she asked Salvatore. He opened the case, and she lifted the manuscript with the careful, reverent precision of someone who had been taught by personal obsession how to handle old things, and laid it open on the reading stand he'd provided, and began to read. She read for 4 minutes. Then she looked up at Harry with her eyes very bright and said, "It's complete. The full framework. Everything the citation chain implied." She paused, her voice controlled over the excitement. "And there's something else. There's a second section. The citations never mention a second section." Harry came to stand beside her and read. The Ravenclaw legacy processed the archaic notation with its usual immediate clarity, but it was the Emery's legacy that responded most strongly, pulling forward, engaged, recognizing. The second section was not theory. It was application, specifically, the application of the foundational framework to a problem that the author described as the greatest technical challenge in magical practice: the permanent dispersal of fragmented consciousness. Harry and Hermione looked at each other. "Horcruxes," she said. "Yes," he said. The 1642 manuscript, written by a witch named Isabella Costanza, whose name Harry did not recognize from any archive but would, had a complete, tested methodology for destroying Horcruxes. Not extracting, not containing. Destroying, with a precision and safety that the methodologies Dumbledore had been working with for decades didn't approach. It included specific techniques for each type of anchoring object. It included a section on fragments embedded in living hosts that described, with startling accuracy, exactly what Harry had done at Gringotts, and extended it, showed the fuller version, showed what could have been done that hadn't been known. Crane was reading over Harry's other shoulder. He was very quiet. "She worked this out in 1642, Harry said. "And it was purchased by the Lestrange family in 1891, Hermione said. "Who clearly never read it carefully enough to understand what they had." She paused. "Or who understood exactly what they had and kept it away from anyone who might use it against them." Harry looked at Ragnarok. "Formal scholarly acquisition," Ragnarok said. He'd been reading his copy of the treaty documentation. The 1689 treaty allows Gringotts to facilitate the transfer of historically significant magical documents to institutional archives for preservation purposes. With the owner's consent. "Salvatore," Harry said, and looked at the curator, who was watching from the doorway with the expression of a man who had just understood that this was not a standard scholarly visit. He explained. He was honest and direct and offered a compensation figure that Ragnarok had prepared, which was more than fair by any standard. Salvatore listened and looked at the manuscript and looked at Harry and said, in careful English, "My employer is not in Britain." "I know," Harry said. "He will not be pleased." "No," Harry agreed. "But the treaty is clear, and Gringotts' authority under it is clear, and the manuscript status as historically significant has been established by the citation chain we've documented." He held Salvatore's gaze. "I am not taking it from you. I am asking you to agree to a formal institutional transfer that protects you entirely from any claim of impropriety. Everything that happens after that transfer is between the Lestrange family and Gringotts, which is not your concern." Salvatore looked at the manuscript. He was a man who loved books. He looked at a book that had been sitting in a side room for a century and a third, uncatalogued, incompletely understood, and Harry could see the calculation happening, what it was worth to have it properly understood versus what it cost him to facilitate the process. "I'll need the formal documentation," he said. "Already drafted," Ragnarok said, and produced it. They came back to Linfred Hall on a Wednesday evening with the manuscript in a Gringotts grade containment case and 4 people's worth of thoughts that needed to be organized. Hermione sat at the library table and started making notes immediately, which was her version of decompressing. Crane stood at the blackboard for 10 minutes without writing anything, which was his version of the same thing. Ragnarok went to the flue to file the acquisition paperwork and contact the Gringotts archivists who would begin the full transcription process. Harry stood at the library window and looked out at the Cotswolds evening, the beaches, the garden, the ward line that he could feel as clearly as the floor under his feet, and thought about Isabella Costanza, who had worked this out alone in 1642 and whose work had been bought and buried for 130 years, and what that meant about the shape of knowledge and who got to keep it and who paid for what was lost. His scar didn't itch. It hadn't itched since March. The place where it had been was just a mark now, a lightning bolt on a forehead, with nothing behind it but scar tissue and old light. He thought about the remaining Horcruxes, the cup, the locket, the diadem, the snake. He thought about Costanza's methodology, which was going to change every one of those problems from difficult to manageable. He thought about Dumbledore, who was going to read the manuscript tomorrow and who was going to sit with it quietly for a long time before saying anything. He thought about Crouch, whose access to the registration records was now documented and in the hands of the Wisengamot's investigative subcommittee. Not destroyed yet. Still powerful, still positioned, still the head of magical law enforcement. But visible, which was the first necessary step. He thought about Neville's paper, which had been accepted by the Herbology Quarterly and which had Neville's name on it alone, as it should, as the researcher who had done the work. He thought about Hermione's letter to Colette Marchand in Paris, which had started something that had led to a 1642 manuscript and a methodology that was going to change the Horcrux hunt, because Hermione had found an error in a paper and thought to write to the person who'd made it, and that small decision had threaded through everything. He thought about Ragnarok, who had knelt, fractionally, precisely, once, on the floor of the Gringotts lobby and had been building something with Harry ever since with the patient, serious attention of someone who recognized a long investment worth making. He thought about Dumbledore, who had come to Linfred Hall expecting a child and found something else and had been, slowly and with the genuine difficulty of changing patterns that had been set for decades, becoming something more honest in his presence. The fire in the library grate was burning its clean blue-white, and Harry turned from the window to the room, the library that had once been empty and was full now, with books and chalk and the small signs of work being done seriously, and felt the 10 legacies in him the way he felt them always now, not as separate presences but as one coherent thing, the 10 voices resolved into a single way of being that was his. Not Peveril's. Not Slytherin's or Gryffindor's or Merlin's. His. "Harry," Hermione said, from the table, without looking up. "The Costanza methodology for cup and locket is almost identical to what Gringotts did for the ring. Come look at the notation." He went and looked. She was right, and the notation was elegant, and there was an extension in the third section that he needed Crane to see immediately because it addressed a problem with the diadem destruction that they'd been treating as theoretically unsolvable. "Crane," Harry said. Crane was at the board. He came over, looked, and said one word, "Remarkable." "The unsolvable problem isn't," Harry said. "No," Crane agreed. "It appears it never was." He paused. Costanza had good handwriting, at least. Some of the early Italian manuscripts are absolute chaos. Hermione made a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been immediately refocused into a question about the third section's variable parameters. Harry sat at the table beside her and pulled the manuscript case toward him and opened it, and the three of them worked through the methodology together in the warm library evening while outside the Cotswolds went gently dark and the wardstones in the garden held their patient watch and the world remained large and complicated and full of things that needed doing. He was 8 years old. He had 10 crowns and 1 head and a library full of people who had chosen to show up. It was, he thought, enough to be going on with.